Unfortunately, this is a true story. This was back before the internet was a news source, so I don't have any articles to link, but I do vividly remember reading about it in a newspaper afterward. I was really young when this happened. 1990s to ballpark the time, back when I was in elementary school. I'm 27 now. Back then, I lived in an apartment complex some ways away from school, so every morning I would hop on my bike and pedal begrudgingly to school. Same route every morning. I also had a Hindu family for my next door neighbors. They were nice people, and I often had their kids over because they didn't really have any toys at their house. And you know, kids can't hang out without their toys. This particular morning will always stand out in my mind from any others. I was biking to school, coming up on a cross street. My neighbor and her son were walking ahead of me. I remember seeing them a couple feet from the curb, in a car turning from the far lane on the street leading into the one they were crossing. I must have looked away, because the next thing I remember is looking up and seeing the boy laying flat on the ground right next to the curb, his mother kneeling, leaning over him, and screaming. This was a while before cell phones. I remember with acute clarity being in shock and riding past them. Time seemed to slow down. The boy was face up, staring blankly at the sky with blood trickling out of his nose. His foot was twitching, but other than that, he seemed motionless. I will never forget that face. His mother's wails will never leave me. I went to school that day because I didn't know what I should do, what I could do. I ended up reading in the newspaper some days later that he'd slipped into a coma, and they'd found the person who had hit him. It was a female drunk driver. Thankfully, the boy did survive and came out of his coma, but he was paralyzed from the neck down thereafter. I don't remember talking to him or playing with him again after that. Maybe they moved. But this experience will always stay with me, and will always be a reminder of why you should never, ever drink and drive. No excuses. My place of work is very haunted. I work in an old veterans hospital that has been converted into offices. It does feel a little bit strange consistently entering a room, only to realize that it isn't a hospital anymore, but an office building equipped with cubicles and computers. On my first day on the job, I encountered some really unsettling activity. I consider myself a pretty logical person, so I don't want you to dismiss this as merely fiction or chalk this up to seeing things or hallucinating. Anyway, I was in my usual office tending to my daily activities. I was alone in the building that day and had to close up when I heard what I thought was a male voice coming from down the hall. The voice sounded raspy, but soft. Again, I was the only one there at the time, so I walked down the hall to trace the source of the sound. I was able to catch a glimpse of a male spirit peeking out from what is now the photocopy room, but I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes. It was a look of helplessness, a feeling of absolute despair, and before I could even think anymore, the image of the man faded into thin air. Then there was perhaps the most peculiar experience of them all, and happened a few days after seeing the raspy-voiced man. I know before I get into this particular one, you're going to laugh, but I shit you not, I was not laughing at this particular moment. Sure, you can tell me that this was bullshit, that I was making it all up, and all that other crap, but all I can give you is my word. I was running behind schedule on this particular day at the office and getting frustrated. On top of that, my boss asked me to work overtime and close up for him, and I reluctantly agreed to do so. Finding myself alone again, it was just after 9 p.m. when I finally got caught up with all my paperwork. I quickly tried to close up everything and head out through the hallway and out the door to the parking lot, but I stopped before that. Again, this was highly unusual, because there was no logical explanation for this, but what I saw next was perplexing. I looked into the conference room, and I could have sworn I saw a bearded man dressed in all white with long brown hair, kneeling over another man, as if trying to resuscitate him, and the man throwing up a peace sign a millisecond later. It was creepy to me at the time, but I felt an overwhelming sense of peace too. This all lasted not even 30 seconds. Now, I'm not going to say that this was Jesus or something like that, but the timing was too impeccable. I couldn't tell if this was the same man from the day before, or if it was another spirit, but it almost seemed as if the bearded man came to his rescue, possibly taking him up to heaven. Again, I'm not even close to being a religious person, so I don't know how these circumstances work. The following experiences weren't as climactic as the ones above, but still unsettling to say the least. A couple of months later, I could have sworn I saw two shadow people at the end of the hall early in the morning, then immediately noticed another bolt in front of a desk halfway down the hall. Wasn't able to get a good look at them, just knew they were shadow people. At the same time, my husband got the chills when I told him. Months later, I even saw a soldier standing outside of what was the operating room at one time. His head was down as if praying. The rest of the experiences here are still filled with much activity. I've had my husband visit the office, and he's experiencing things as well. There used to be a morgue on another floor, and he once heard a yelp coming from the used-to-be morgue room. My husband had even encountered seeing shadows in the men's bathroom and would constantly experience spirits turning off the lights in the bathroom. The only sensible conclusion I could come up with was that there was no way that a person could sneak in because the doors are very creaky. We're not the only ones who have experienced these things, as other employees have openly discussed spirits being in this building. One gentleman took the elevator up and had a conversation with another gentleman. When his floor came, he turned to wish the other man a good day, and no one was there. Some have spoken of footsteps late in the evening. One guy got to a point he would tell the spirit it was just him, and the steps stopped. Yeah, to say this is a haunted area is kind of an understatement. Thanks for reading my story. I had to come back home 7 years ago to help my mom. My dad had passed the year before, and it was becoming too much to go back and forth. I was working at the time, and Mom could still get around. I have to mention that Mom has since passed away. She's been gone for nearly 4 years now. Anyway, this particular event happened on a Wednesday, and I will forever remember it. My mom had already gotten up and was going downstairs to fix herself something for breakfast. I went into the bathroom to wash up. I had a funny feeling come over me. I can't explain it other than to say I felt something was very wrong. For one thing, I haven't heard any noises from the kitchen. The bathroom is at the top of the stairs, so I opened the door and listened. Nothing. I grabbed my robe and was about to go down the stairs when I saw this woman at the bottom. She startled me and I froze. We stood staring at each other for maybe 10 seconds. She had shoulder-length brown hair and a white floor-length gown. She never spoke. She did, however, point towards the kitchen. My heart sank. I understood immediately. I ran past her and into the kitchen. I turned into the dining room and screamed, "Mom." She was lying unresponsive on the floor. I ran over to her crying like a baby. I kept calling her and trying to pick her up. I pulled up one of the chairs and tripped while trying to get my mom into it. We both crashed to the floor, but I finally got up and pulled her onto it. I was hysterical. I kept trying to talk to her, but she just stared at me. I ran to the phone and dialed 911. The fire department is right around the corner, so they got there in no time. Her blood pressure was sky high. We went to the hospital and I called my sister. My mom stayed for 3 days and came back home. We found out she had a clot in her heart. She had gone into the dining room to sit down and catch her breath and just collapsed. Later that day, I went home And only did I remember the lady. I got on my knees and thanked God for letting me be at home that day, and for finding my mom and myself worthy enough for him to send an angel to alert me about her situation. That was May 2013. She died November 13th, 2013. Let me finish by saying that I've been in the healthcare field for over 20 years, but when you see what I described, everything you ever learned goes right out the window. Out with my two brothers and my dad fishing at around 12 in the morning. Me being maybe 12 or 13 at the time, William was older and Jason was younger. We were on a bridge that stood over a large body of water, and I was honestly becoming a bit bored since we had been fishing for the past hour. The only real exciting thing that happened was when my dad hooked a skate. It was a kick watching him struggle to maintain the pole. He had let out a mean steam of curses when his line snapped, signaling his loss in the battle. The area was surrounded by forest and was beautifully lit by the night sky. I would look over the bridge's wall countless times just to see the moon's light reflecting off of the dark, steady waves. The bridge wasn't made of wood, but concrete. It was strange looking. Now that I think about it, instead of being only about 3 feet off the surface of the water, it was maybe 10 or 15. I assumed that it was made for walking or riding across. It was narrow, but just wide enough to fit 3 average people side by side. Upon stating that I wasn't having much fun, William led Jason and I down to a large blackberry bush. It was set just next to the beginning of the bridge, so my dad could still see us. With our group, we had 4 dogs. It seems like a lot, I know, but we currently still have only 2 of our said 4 dogs. Tragedies happen, I suppose. Back to the story. 2 of the dogs are German Shepherds, the dogs we have currently. Other than them, we had a border collie and a foxhound and Muda mix, a very beautiful dog, tall and slender, but with just the right amount of muscle. He was all white with the exception of fall points and freckles. Also, very, very fast. Here's the confusing but necessary part. The female German Shepherd was Charlie, the male German Shepherd was Simon, the foxhound mix was Buddy, and the border collie was Sophie. Okay, now that we've gotten that down, on with the occurrence. We weren't really collecting the berries. It was more of a pick and eat thing. Every now and then, one of us would shout out, startled by the sudden prick of their finger from a thorn. Charlie and Buddy were my personal dogs, leaving Jason with Sophie and my dad with Simon. As I was feeling around for berries with Charlie sitting at my side, Jason left to get my dad some. I turned around to watch him go, Sophie at his heels. Before I could turn back around to face the bush, something caught my eye. Something big. My first thought was that it was a tree, that is, until it turns its head towards me. It locked eyes with me. I felt paralyzed by fear. I barely managed to wave my arm around in William's general direction, trying to catch his attention. He must have noticed as he responded with a quiet yeah. Turning to see what I was looking at, he began to say something, but immediately stopped. All emotion drained from his now pale face. "Who is that?" he would ask me. I could only mumble what. Not that I didn't hear him, no, I was correcting him. This thing was massive. Really, the only color you could see on the creature came from its eyes. They were wide, human-like. From where I stood, they almost looked orange. The rest was basically a silhouette. I could feel the presence of the dog next to us. Charlie snarled, stalking closer bit by bit. I wanted to jump at her, do anything to keep her away from it. Simon was staring intently, as was Buddy, but kept his position in front of William and me. The thing was standing on its hind legs, but looked like a big, hairy dog, at least something with long, pointed ears. It had lengthy fingers, or more than likely, claws. It leaned forward a bit, but not much, almost as if it wanted to intensify its glare, or maybe just to get a better look at us. I jumped at the sound of Charlie snapping her jaws at the thing before bounding towards it. I nearly choked on my breath as Buddy followed her. I frantically looked around for Simon, who was cowering behind William with his head bowed down, growling. William started to run faster after them, and I started to cry, from both fear and slight anger. I heaved a breath and willed my lungs to run as fast as I could. William was on the track team and played baseball, but he was the least of my worries, because I was too. It was the fact that we were chasing two dogs and a terrifying animal-like creature. Now that I think back on what I did, I must have been insane. Nevertheless, I chased them in the woods. We eventually slowed to a stop as we saw the dogs ahead of us. They were standing defensively, barking and snarling the cryptid. I couldn't see exactly, but it looked as though the creature was now on four legs and smaller. The dogs fell back, as though they had been pushed and scurried away from it as an ear-piercing scream sounded. Buddy took off back to the bridge, where we later found him, and Charlie crouched in front of William and I. The scream sounded strangled, unlike anything I'd ever heard. I had let out a fearful shout before I felt something grab hold of my wrist, which, believe me, did not help my situation. William was trying to pull me along, trying to get us the hell out of there. All three of us ran towards the bridge. The whole way there, it felt as though the creature was on my heels, me being in the back by maybe a foot. Once we were free from the trees, we didn't stop. We bolted into the water, William and I. Charlie merely followed, not knowing what to do. I whipped my head around as we stopped and saw nothing but pine. I choked on my tears, feeling both relieved and terrified of what had just gone down. Back on the bridge, we told our dad. He called bullshit, that we were just playing a prank. But you heard the scream, right? We would ask him. He would blow us off completely and continue fishing. He was, and still is, a skeptic. Gotta see it to believe it, is his paranormal motto. I honestly don't know what that thing was, and I don't think I want to. Part of me is curious, but all of me wants to know what I'm dealing with, so I have more information on the subject. I can't be the only one who's seen it. Today, I'm going to tell you a story I haven't told anyone before, simply because they will think I'm crazy. I don't know why all this even began, but what I do remember is when. It was 7 a.m. in the morning. I was all alone in my house, which I share with my family. I was sitting in the dining room while reading a book. I knew that I was alone. I heard someone. I heard my brother's voice. He was calling my name and asking me where I am. I was extremely confused because I checked his bedroom and saw that it was empty. I stood up and walked towards the voice. It was in the hallway. There was nobody there. I suddenly saw someone's shadow. I was so scared I ran out and waited for my bus outside. For the next 2 years, things moved in our house. My bed moved. My bedroom was also colder than everybody else's. I always had a feeling somebody was watching me as I fell asleep, but yesterday, there was something far worse. I fell asleep with a huge feeling of being watched, but I also smelled some kind of cologne, a man's cologne that I have never smelled before. I shook it off and soon fell asleep. Around 3 a.m. in the morning, I woke up gasping for air. I couldn't move, breathe, or even scream. I felt my arms touching my head, neck, my belly and legs. I heard some kind of language being spoken in my ear. I tried so hard to scream, but I wasn't able to. That went on until the morning. They would let me go for 5 minutes and then continue their torture. After they finally let me go, I had a huge panic attack. I didn't sleep. Today I'm scared. I don't want to eat. I see them. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. I'm afraid to sleep and I'm afraid of the dark. My husband and I moved into a house built on an old battlefield ground. This field goes on for miles and miles, then there's nothing but graves. Such a bloody massacre happened a long time ago during the Civil War in Nancy, Kentucky. When we first moved there, strange activity immediately started happening. We began hearing voices outside mumbling to each other. Note that we have no one that lives close to us for miles. We go outside to investigate and find nothing. We go back inside. It starts up again. We try to fall asleep and hear old music, kind of like an old music box. This keeps us awake for some time. We were never able to pinpoint the location of the music. Every there on out, activities increase. We go on outside on our porch and sit. At night, we see shadow figures moving along the trees within the woods. We'd also be in the living room and hear something walking on our front porch often. We run outside to investigate. Nothing there. My body was numb from fear. My husband, trying to act calm, was looking at me. I could tell he was in shock like I was. We knew this was something paranormal, And we are very skeptical people about paranormal stuff too, until this happened to us. It changed everything. A whole new door opened up that we were not familiar with. We thought maybe if we don't think about it much, maybe it would just stop. So living there for a week now, we decided to make a flower garden together and enjoy the beautiful weather. I put some little bunny figurines in the garden and also little chickens and turtles. That night we started hearing footsteps again on our front porch. This time I told my husband let's not go out. I was hoping maybe it'd just stop if we just ignored it. It kept going on for a good while. We also noticed it's now pounding loudly on our windows. Okay, we had a candle on the windowsill outside. We lit it nightly to keep mosquitoes away, but we hadn't lit it for days. The pounding was getting aggressive after a few days. I look out the window and the candle was lit. My husband and I were surprised to say the least. So we went outside to investigate and look at the candle. I noticed that my little chicken figurines in the flower garden were turned upside down. The next night, I put an app on my phone that allows me to capture EVPs in video in low-light situations. My husband thought I was crazy and was skeptical about capturing anything, but I started talking and asking, "What do you want and who are you?" My EVP app was going off in the direction where my husband was standing. I snapped a picture outside in the dark with my husband posing against the wall. We went inside and reviewed the photo. Amazingly, we saw a dark shadow figure of a man floating behind my husband in old clothes. Now we got proof. We showed it to family and friends, and they agreed something is going on here. The place crept me out so much, we decided to move. I found out later that someone died on that property in a garage fire a long time ago. I don't know if that death is related to the Civil War, or is the cause of our hauntings, or it's the old soldiers still there, or maybe both. What I do know is that strange things happen there. This whole ordeal happened when I was around 10 years old to 13 years old when I lived in a particular house. The house was quite old. It first belonged to my grandmother when she was younger, and at the time, we were renting from her. Many of my grandmother's antique personal items still occupied the house that had belonged to much older relatives that had passed. The importance of these objects was that objects of those who passed away could channel their energy, and this shadow man I had seen could have possibly been an old relative. He could have even been one that had passed away in my lifetime, since there was actually quite a few deaths of older male relatives whom I still quite miss a lot. The first I was aware of this man, I was around 10 years old. The memory is faint, but I am positive of what I felt and saw at the time. I was in my room with a friend, and we were chatting away when we heard sort of a distinct creaking sound. When we turned our heads, we noticed the shade on a lamp that was on my dresser had somehow flown off of the lamp to a nearby spot on the dresser. Being the young child I was freaked out, and we stayed in the living room the rest of the night. I was about 12 years old, I believe, when I first actually saw the figure who had done plenty of subtle disturbances throughout the years since my first encounter with it. I had stayed home from school since I was pretty sick and was watching Drake and Josh on television to pass the time. I heard the front door open, and then saw, as well as felt, a tall man out of the corner of my eye passing by the entryway to the TV room which I was in. Automatically I called out, "Hey Dad," thinking he had returned from work early. There was no response. I paused the show and the house was dead silent. The feeling of the man's presences was gone too. I knew that I had seen something tall and shadow-like walk somewhat quickly past the entryway. I got up to investigate and found that the house was indeed empty. My whole body was shaking, so I did what came to mind. I cuddled up in my blanket on the couch and turned the volume up to try and erase the so prominent fear that had filled me and waited for my parents to come home. I had seen the shadow man a couple of times after that, each time thinking it was my father, and each time finding out it was not. Those memories are far less prominent in my mind, but are still there. We moved from the house later the next year, and since then, I have not seen nor felt the shadow man. Have you ever seen a shadow figure like this? This is my story of what happened to me at work. I don't know if it's a ghost or anything, but I hope that someone may have opinions. Okay, so I was walking back from giving someone their food to go back to the kitchen. Then I saw a little boy outside of the door. He looked like a normal little kid, so I smiled and walked on. I didn't think anything of it. But then, he was at the drive-thru window. Then again, was back at the door. And so on until the last part. I saw his head at the same time in the door and the window, with a little smile. Then he went back to one and I saw him running. Then he disappeared into the parking lot. The weird thing about it was 9 p.m. and it looked to be about 5 years old. No adults around. It's not the first time I've seen a little boy appear before. One time I was at home and I'd seen a little shadow boy. I went to tap him on the head because I thought it was my brother. My hand went through his head. Description: around 5. Not pale skin, but not tan either. Bluish gray eyes, sandy brown hair. Wore a striped shirt with gray pants. Cute little smile with a few crooked teeth. Was he a ghost too? Thank you. New Orleans, the Bayou, cemetery tours. Witnessed the devastating effects of Katrina, and right on time to watch my son play college baseball. Then my guests entered into my experience. My first experience started when I captured the most beautiful sunset from home plate facing the swampy area where we were playing. As I looked at the picture, I noticed 2 orbs. One was quite noticeable, as it was a small ball of light in the bottom of the photo. The second was a strobe light coming from the sun behind the clouds. Okay, I'll get to the best part. So I checked into the Whitney Hotel, located Midtown New Orleans, rich in history. An old bank that is still in use, but is also the hotel that has been renovated with 9 floors of winding halls, leading one to get very confused and turn around, so to speak. Let me mention, the entire time I stayed at this hotel, there was not one other guest ever spotted by myself or my parents. In fact, the only people you saw were the same 5 employees that all seemed to be interacting amongst themselves in an odd sort of way. They were always there. One was the chef, yet never saw one person sitting, eating, or drinking in the restaurant and bar. These same characters were always around, out of nowhere. They were eager to share stories of the hurricane, history of the hotel, and the architecture and other tidbits of the city. What I thought so peculiar was there was nothing ever mentioned of ghosts or hauntings. I will preface this by saying there was a strong sense of something, but I could not quite place my finger on what it was exactly. I finally put it out there and asked, "What about ghosts?" The 2 staff members shared a look and stated, "Oh, you can say that." They shared hearing silverware falling in the middle of the night, sounds from the 100-year-old basement, and the bank vault closing and locking when no one was around. I retired to my room, 6:11, at around 8 p.m. I noticed the complete quietness of the floor. Again, not one other room guest was around. I laid down and fell asleep. Approximately 2:13 p.m., I became aware of a feeling between my legs, as if I had been punched. I was in somewhere between sleep and wake, and had remembered the feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me someone is in this room. I laid there paralyzed as I tried to rationalize what was happening. Was there someone in my room? Why isn't the spot where it was hit not as excruciating as it should be? There was still the feeling, but no pain, rather a strong pressure feeling. Then I felt the most gut-wrenching, gut feeling, sick to your stomach feeling began to rise in me. The feeling that someone was there, and this was not going to be good. My heart was racing. I was frozen, unable to roll over to look in the direction where I felt the person was standing. 30 seconds in, I am now fully aware and awake and scared to death. I thought, I need to get control. I can either lay here or take action. At this point, I leaped out of the bed and walked 3 feet to where I felt the person standing, as it was in the direction of the restroom. It was at this point that I swear there was a figure, see-through, dressed in black and white, streaks in the face area. It wasn't a pleasant presence. This feeling I had was of sheer terror. Then it was gone. As I gathered my bearings, slowed my heart, and tried to rationalize what I just experienced, I felt a sort of calm presence come over me. I laid back down, and I instantly fell right back to sleep. I awoke refreshed and wondered why it was so easy for me to fall back to sleep. In the past with nightmares, it's always been difficult. Not this time. I didn't mention this to anyone for a few days, but that feeling of complete terror, dread stayed with me. I returned to work and shared the experience with a coworker. The fact that it was so real and the feelings it caused me is what prompted me to share my experience and hopefully can find others with similar stories so I don't feel like I am crazy. Thanks for reading. Several years ago as a child, around the age of 7 in the town of Wheat Ridge, Colorado, there was a Mexican restaurant that was operational in the same building that is now known as Clancy Irish Bar and Grill. I'm 34 now, so that tells you how long it has been. It's been so long that I actually have no recollection of the event that I'm about to speak on, but my sister swears that the story is true. It was questionable until several years later, my 5-year-old daughter had a similar experience in the same restaurant. Now let me rewind to the beginning of the story. Keep in mind the building still exists under the current restaurant name of Clancy's Irish Pub and Grill. My sister is 8 years older than me, and every now and then, she would always talk about the event that happened when I was 7. At that time, it was a Mexican restaurant that was very popular and well known. As a family, we had gone there one night to eat, and being the ordinary little punk that I was, I'd wandered off to explore and ran up the stairs to the next level of the restaurant. The upstairs was apparently closed to customers and is where the restaurant office was held. My sister said she saw me run up the stairs, and so she chased after me to take me back downstairs. All she remembers is seeing me stop, as if I was frozen, at the very top of the stairs for some reason. She called out to me from the bottom of the stairs. However, she said it looked as if I was staring at something and was in a trance and would not budge or acknowledge her. She then walked up the stairs to grab me, thinking I was ignoring her. Immediately upon reaching the top, she felt a cold chill and said she had felt also extremely uneasy and even scared. A few years later, the restaurant closed down and the building was left abandoned for over 10 years until another restaurant decided to take it over again. My family and I were living only a few blocks away at the time and saw that there was a construction crew remodeling the inside and just doing minor touch-ups to the exterior. Seeing the remodel, I couldn't help but think about the story my sister would speak about from time to time. I told my wife about the story, and of course, she did not believe it. A couple weeks after the restaurant had been open for business, I decided we should go eat there, just to see what it looked like after the remodel, and to also try the food. When we arrived to the restaurant, I picked my daughter up and carried her toward the building. As soon as we got closer to the building, my daughter instantly started screaming and yelling and having a fit, even though she was perfectly happy while in the car. When we got inside the restaurant, my daughter started screaming even louder, and as we passed the staircase, she looked up and pointed up to the top of the stairs while still screaming her head off. We decided to leave shortly after because she would not settle down. As soon as we got in the car, she instantly stopped screaming and calmed down. This may be a coincidence. However, the next week, my wife and I talked to my wife's mom while visiting her and told her of the story of when I was young. We also told her the situation with my daughter when we went there recently. Her mom asked where it was located, and after we told her, she gave us a very serious and shocked look and told us a story of her own. Her mom told us that her friend at work had recently spoke about her son doing an electrical job at the same building during the remodel. Her friend's son apparently was an electrician and was working upstairs when he heard someone whisper in his ear, "Look outside." Just after hearing that, he heard a loud crash outside. He ran to the window and saw that someone had crashed directly into the parked work truck. He also had told her that he was the only one upstairs at the time when he heard the voice and then the crash happened. This restaurant also later closed within a month and was then bought out by Clancy's. Clancy's is still there, and I also believe it is still haunted upstairs. I've always wanted to visit again and speak with the employees just to see if they had any stories of their own. However, I've never been back since. Thank you for reading. When I was a teenager, I had kind of a chip on my shoulder from family problems, etc. So often, I would not be very emotional with friends or show my feelings. I had a best friend. Her name was Rhonda. We just clicked from the moment we met 2 years prior to her death. We both like talking about things like life after death and paranormal stuff. We once told each other that whoever passed away first, we would contact the other. Little was I to even imagine at that time that this would indeed come true. I remember one time we went swimming with a few friends, and one friend took me in the deep part of the water, knowing I could not swim, and let me go. I almost drowned, and Rhonda was the only friend who came and sat with me while I was crying because it scared me so bad. She was very empathetic to me. Rhonda herself was an excellent swimmer. She had awards on her bedroom wall that she had earned from swimming events, yet she understood what it must have been like for me to have almost drowned not knowing how to swim. That is the quality of a best friend. In 1982, I was 15 years old and my best friend Rhonda was 17. She was looking forward to turning 18 in 3 short months. We talked daily, went for walks, did all the teenage stuff together. One day she called me on the phone and asked me if I wanted to go to an outdoor type of party at Cullen Park, a small boat dock park at the Maumee River. It was a very hot day in July, the 27th to be exact. She said about 5 other people were going, and that they were going to have a cookout, play volleyball, and go swimming. I said to her, swimming? Why would you go swimming in the Maumee River? She said she had done it before, and that you just had to wear your sneakers or water shoes to not get cut by rocks or glass under the water. I still did not like the idea of going in that fish-smelling dirty water, so I told her and she said, well, you don't have to go in the water. I know you don't swim anyway. She said I can just go for the cookout and maybe playing volleyball. I said okay. I have $20 in my pocket and I could chip in for food and drinks. Yes, I will go. We hung up the phone. I sat there thinking to myself and thought, I just don't know if I want to go. I called her back and I said, Rhonda, I don't know. I think I'm going to pass on this. And she responds by saying, oh, come on, Rose, you will have fun. At first I said, okay, I will go. And then I changed my mind again. Finally, I said for sure no, I'm not going to go. Sorry. And she responds again, fine, be that way, and hung up the phone. That would be the last words I would ever hear from her. I sat there in my kitchen and I felt so bad. I had nothing else to do that day and I thought to myself, maybe I should go. I called her back and her mom answered the phone and she already left. So I pretty much dropped the idea then and there. The next day, I was sitting in the dining room of my home where I live with my dad, and there was a little black and white TV we had on a table that was turned on. The new news was on. I looked at the TV and saw a picture of my boyfriend Doug, who was 18 at the time, and it said that he had gotten electrocuted to death by climbing an electrical fence the night before, July 26th. I was in shock. I could not believe what I was seeing or hearing on the TV. The first thing I did was dial Rhonda's phone number. I wanted to tell my best friend what had happened to my boyfriend. I guess you could say I really needed my best friend at that moment. Her phone was busy. I tried another 3 or 4 times and kept getting a busy signal. I ran down the street 2 blocks down to another friend's house. He was an older friend of the family. I was very distraught and just in total shock. I ran all the way there. He answered his door and I spurted out what had happened and he said, come on, you need to calm down. We can go for a car ride and a talk. So we go to get in the car and a neighbor of his came running up to his car and said, did you hear what happened? He said, what? The neighbor said Rhonda, who lived 1 block from him and that he also knew, had drowned in the Maumee River. He said that they were looking for her body. Now, I was already in shock about my boyfriend, and then I hear my best friend is dead. I didn't believe it. I said, no, you are a liar. That's my best friend. My other friend got me in the car, where I proceeded to fall apart crying. I can't remember the ride or even getting home after that, or even what we said. The next thing I can remember is standing at Cullen Park, looking at the river where many others were looking for my friend. I told myself, no, she couldn't have drowned. She was such a good swimmer. With all the warts she had hanging on her wall from swimming, there's no way she could have drowned. But what I didn't know was the river has currents in it, and that is what took her down. I had told myself, She must have swam to one of the little grassy islands around there, and she is knocked out, but someone will find her. It was 2 days before they found her body in the river. All I can remember is not being able to sleep, shaking a lot, for months and months. I worried that my best friend and boyfriend never knew how I felt about him. Because I didn't show my emotions or say things like I love you or you are my best friend, my biggest worries were that they left this world and did not even know how much I cared about them. There was no funeral showing for either of them, for obvious reasons, which made it kind of hard to accept they were really gone. So now, skip ahead 5 years. I've been bothered by them not knowing each day of my life. It was something I felt horrible about. One night, not even specifically thinking of either of them, I went to bed. I had a dream. I was sitting in my bedroom, and the furniture was arranged just how I had never had it before arranged, and Rhonda, my deceased best friend, was sitting next to me on the bed, and we were talking. I wanted to tell her she was my best friend and that I missed her so much, and how much it had hurt me that she died. But I could not get the words out. And then I just realized, in the dream, that my left arm was itching really bad. Before I went to scratch my arm, Rhonda said, "You need to scratch your left arm, Rose." I looked at her and I said, "How did you know my arm was itching?" And she said, I know how you feel." She had a smile and that unique giggle she had that I missed so much, and she kept saying, I know how you feel." The dream ended there. She was telling me she knew the things I was feeling without me actually having to say it. This was a visitation in my dream. I know that for sure. Very shortly after that dream visitation, I also had one from my boyfriend, Doug, who had died the day before my best friend did. In that dream, we were in my bathroom and I was crying. I was crying harder than I ever cried in my life, and he was holding me saying, "It's okay, Rose. It's okay." He also said, "I know how hurt you are, and I know you cared about me." I kept telling him I was sorry, so sorry, and that's where that dream ended. These were not dreams that I willed to happen. I've lost many other relatives, including my mother and father, and have never had a dream like that about them. I'd never had a dream before those two that were so real to me. I'm 50 years old now, and I remember every single aspect of those two dreams, and I know my boyfriend and my best friend and boyfriend visited me in a dream state because it would have scared me any other way. In the dream, I felt safe and everything felt normal. It was like I knew they were gone in the dream, but it seemed normal to see them and to be talking to them. Wow, I have to say, it has taken a lot out of me to write this stuff out, to go through those emotions again, reliving such tragedy, but I felt it important to share this with you. It is a 100% true story, which can be proved from newspaper archives about both their deaths, and I have copies in a scrapbook and stuff from both of them. Blessings, Rose. It was raining heavily that night. I was on my way back from the night class. I boarded a double-decker bus. Thinking that I might be more quiet to take a nap upstairs, I took a seat on the center of the bus in the upper part. The bus takes 30 minutes to reach the terminal, which was near where I stayed. I closed my eyes, thinking of taking a short nap. After about 10 minutes, I heard a boy talking to his mother. I was sure that I was the only passenger aboard that bus. Then the little boy was speaking in a very different language, from which I could hardly understand. Looking at his mom, half of her face was covered by her long hair, so I didn't really have a chance to see her face. When I closed my eyes once again, I felt like the boy was sitting beside me and was whispering in my ear. I opened my eyes again, and he was at his seat and pointing at me, laughing loudly. It felt so eerie. Then suddenly, I felt a gust of cold wind blow past me, followed by a sound of a girl in a low pitch talking to her boyfriend behind me. I turned my head, and at the same time, the rain and thunder outside the window sounded heavy and loud. I could hardly hear what they were saying. I remember I was the only one on the upper decker when I boarded, and I closed my eyes less than 10 minutes. Why were there 4 others on the bus? I did not doze off, and I'm sure the bus did not stop. This time, I told myself I need to keep my eyes open. I was worried if I closed my eyes again, Another 2 people might appear. The rain was heavy and the night was quiet, so therefore the bus driver did not stop at most of the bus stops. There were 3 more bus stops to go. I walked down from the upper deck and stood near the driver's seat. The driver said to me, "What a lonely night. You are my only passenger." And I responded by saying, "I beg your pardon?" "There's some other foreign passenger on the upper deck." The driver did not answer me. Then suddenly, the bus skidded and crashed into a tree. I knocked against a metal pole in front of me and fainted. When I opened my eyes, I was still sitting at the bus stop waiting for the bus. It was still raining heavily. I thought I had a dream, but my head was swollen. How can that be? When I turned my head to the left, a heavy-set man was sitting at the first seat. A lady and a boy was sitting right beside me. The lady's hair covered half of her face, which I cannot see clearly, and a boy and a girl were hugging each other behind my seat. I shivered and stood up. The little boy said, "Are you leaving? Our bus is not here yet." I did not turn my head. I waved to the coming by taxi and quickly got inside. When I entered the taxi, the driver said, "What a lonely night. You are my only passenger." I was shocked to hear this twice and felt uneasy. I quickly aligned from the taxi and entered a night coffee shop, took out my mobile phone, and called for my dad. Then the waiter came near me and asked for my order. I ordered 2 cups of coffee, thinking my dad would be here soon. Then I heard the waitress whispering to another, "This lady is ordering a coffee for that little boy also." I turned my head and looked at them, giving me a weird look. The other waitress walked near me and asked, "Are you going to ask your boy to come in, or let him stand outside my door?" I just ignored her, pretending I did not hear what she said, and hoped that my father would be here soon. After the coffee was served, I saw my father enter, and I felt safe. On the way home, I saw the taxi that I just halted was in the accident. It was badly crashed against a tree, and there stood an overweight man, a couple, and a mother holding a boy staring at the taxi, and the nurses were busy carrying the injured man into the ambulance. Lucky, I was not in that taxi. The little boy turned his head, stared at me pointing and laughing. When I reached home, I was sick for almost a week. My mom brought me to a medium, and the medium sent me and my mom to that bus stop to do some spirit chanting and offering. I guess you could say this was one wild night. A lot has been happening lately. Comfortable and uncomfortable things. Some of these happenings just leave me curious and confused as to why all of this is happening. I've been experiencing things to the point where I've broken down, and I shall tell you how and why right now. One day, I was sitting in front of the door to my brother's room, just casually sitting there, listening to music as I waited on my brother to come back. When he finally came, just as I turned my head towards him to say something, I was kept completely shut and frightened over what I had just seen. I let out a small scream, which left my brother worried and motivated him to ask me why I had let out a sudden reaction. I explained it all to him, about how I saw a solid figure of a man that stood right behind him. Now, I really didn't believe in the paranormal, and to see something like this just shook me. I did, and still do believe that spirits are real, but my view on seeing them had totally changed around after this incident. I am religious, and I pray more often than I used to back then, which has helped me a lot because I feel more protected and safe. But it doesn't end there. When I found out that my brother was experiencing the same things as me, we told our mother, and she sat us down to explain it all. We found out that she had similar things happening to her in the past too. And I had also learned that when my mother was trying to get pregnant with her first child, me, that she was targeted by black magic and had been attacked by a shadow person. That gives me a feeling that something or someone, the spirits, may have gotten through some closed doors. I'm not a professional or anything, but it's something I assume may have happened. Anyway, we've had our house checked out by different mediums, and they all said the same things. They told us that something was in this house. But the thing is that I feel like there's more than one spirit in this house. One I sense as good and the other I sense as bad, but not demonically bad. I can feel it in my gut. Most times, out of nowhere, I will occasionally see a black mist pass by the corner of my eyes, but I end up dismissing them as my imagination. The way these spirits contact me are through my dreams, most of the times, rather than in my awake hours, although I've seen the solid figure of a man twice in the same hallway. I had an encounter with the first solid figure that appeared behind my brother. At night, I feel cold touches, especially on the side of my head, and the feelings of pins and needles stuck into my hands. Very recently, it was as if I was completely drained of my energy, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think straight. Hours later, I was totally fine and slept well, but this isn't the only time that something like that has happened. One night, I was sleeping, and I felt this voice speak into my ear. It was vividly clear enough to make me understand the words being said, and the voice was soft, yet in a little harsh tone. It said something like, "You think you're clever, don't you? I'm stronger than you, girl. Try me." That's when I woke up. My heart was racing so fast to examine if one of my siblings played a harmless yet frightening prank on me. But when I realized there was no way for my siblings to do that to me, I froze in shock. My bed was against a wall then, and since my door is a bit broken and the floorboards haven't been fitted back in properly, if you open the door, it would create a loud sound that would make anyone jolt. I'm a light sleeper, by the way, so there was no way that anyone could have pulled it off. Plus, I don't sleep against the wall. I always sleep away from the wall, so I wouldn't have known and felt something get onto my bed and lay beside me. It's just confusing me, all of this. I found myself crying one day because of it. I don't know what to do. I've decided to keep myself devoted to God and to follow the light, as I know that's the only thing that assures me safety. I'm sorry for posting such a long story, but I would like to know your opinions and advice on what I should do or about what's happening to me. Thanks. Number 2. My name is April. I'm 21 and have a story to tell you about the experience I had with the infamous Ouija board. You have heard stories of Zozo the demon, right? Well, he is real, and I have read stories on him, but didn't actually think it was true until it happened to me. 3 months ago, I had moved in with my sister, and I had brought a couple friends over to hang out that evening. We were all smoking a cigarette when I came up with the brilliant idea to play the Ouija board and ask otherworldly spirits questions about the afterlife and questions about the future. Now, I have played the board by myself for many years, with little to no negative spirits speaking with me, but this evening was in fact different. We sat at the table and put our hands on the cursor and moved it clockwise around the board as we said Ouija out loud 3 times. My friends weren't avid believers in the paranormal or using the board from rumors they had heard. I asked, "Is there anyone there?" The cursor moved slowly to yes. "Who are we speaking with?" The cursor repeatedly went from Z to O and continued to do so after the question was asked. "What do you want?" It quickly spelled out her. "Who is her?" I asked. It spelled out my friend's name, and I was freaked. "What do you want with her?" It spelled out, "I want her." Very quickly, the cursor returned to moving from the Z to the O yet again, and I was getting annoyed with this because it wouldn't tell me why it wanted my friend. It just spelled out, "I want her," repeatedly. My friend, the one the demon wanted, stupidly called him a pussy, and the board spelled out death. That's when things got bad. I got angry and told her not to provoke him because he was capable of bad things, and I sure as hell didn't want anything happening to my friends. The other friend just sat there freaked out, not speaking the entire time, as we continued to ask it questions, which I don't recall. The cursor began feeling hot under my fingers, and I asked my friends if they felt it too. They said they did. I asked it another question, but its answer didn't make any sense. It spelled out. The word it spelled out was mama, over and over, and would not move to any other letters, so I cussed at him because I was getting annoyed. The one friend took his hand off the cursor and refused to play anymore, and the atmosphere immediately changed. I could feel Zozo in the room now, and the air was heavy, and I began to get scared. All of a sudden, I didn't feel like myself. I felt if something was inside me. I felt the most intense hatred I've ever felt before. I began to laugh hysterically and then cry like I had no control over my emotions. My mood then turned to hatred again, and I turned to look at my friend, the one the demon wanted, with the most evil smile. I felt it inside. It wasn't me smiling. It was the demon. We all stopped playing the board after that, but the heavy feeling in the air and its presence remained. It took a bit before everything felt normal again that night, and I felt like myself. But when it did, I was certainly relieved. I feared for my friends' safety that night, but fortunately, none of them experienced anything after leaving. My advice? Do not mess with the Ouija board. Evil presence in the flat. Since moving out of the flat, when I was going through my divorce, I've made a point of not going back in there unless it was really necessary. When we had tenants renting the place, I'd no need really, but the tenants left, and my mom decided to move in there. Suddenly, I had to go there quite often. The atmosphere in the place was always thick to me. It was like the air was harder to breathe. On one specific night in April 2015, my mom sent me a message and told me strange things were going on in the flat. Not one to leave my mom alone when she was far less open than I was, I ran to the flat. She was sitting in the lounge when it came in, and she asked me to step into her room and tell me if I smelled anything. As I took the one step into her room and came to the closet, on my left, bed to my right, there was the very distinct smell of cigarette smoke hanging in the air. I walked towards the bed, and the smell decreased, towards the closet, and the smell was stronger. No one in the yard smokes, so the chances that it could have been carried in from outside are zero. The closet is also not close to any windows, so the fact that the smoke was centralized to that spot was enough to get my hair standing on end. I went back to my mom and asked her if this was all she had been experiencing. She said no. The whole week, she could feel someone take hold of her ankles as she lay in bed, until one night, where not only did something take hold of her legs, it pulled her halfway out until she got panicked and started kicking. By then, her legs were completely off of the bed. She swore to me for a second it felt like she had kicked a solid human being, but no one was there to be seen, although she clearly smelled the smoke. The weekend, I had Tim and Eileen over and explained the story to them. Tim went into the flat alone, leaving us by the pool, and after about 5 minutes, he came out. He said that the person in the flat was a man, middle-aged. He gave features to this man that had my mom and I looking at each other. For my South African compatriots, the man looked like a thinner version of Eugene Terror Blanche. I asked Tim if he could see the man's right arm, and Tim told me that the man made an effort of staying in silhouette. I went into Adam's room and fetched my mom's wedding album. I found a picture of my paternal grandfather and showed it to Tim. Tim nodded. The man in the flat was my mom's father, Johnny. Johnny had lost his right arm in a car accident. Considering he had been instrumental in the abuse I suffered in the flat, not to mention that he was responsible for the death of my gran when she was 32 years old. My mom was 5 at the time. Neither my mom nor I were very happy about the fact that he was in our home. My mom told me to take every picture of him out of the album. She took the pictures, gave them to Tim, and told him to burn them. After he had destroyed every picture, Tim told us what he needed to cleanse the flat, and he went in alone. He was busy for close to 2 hours. By then, it was late afternoon. As night came around, my mom went into the flat. For some odd reason, the main switch of the electricity was off. Strange. She switched the power on and went to her bedroom. My son, T, came into the flat and told her he smelled smoke. Since they are both asthmatics, very bad timing. My mom ran out of her room and saw the box that she had set down on the stove catch fire. Yes, not the smartest move putting flammable materials on a stove. Curious though, my mom never cooks in the flat, so the stove mains are always switched off on the circuit. Yet, every plate on the stove was glowing red, turned up to full heat, and the box and its contents were on fire. Mom yelled and grabbed T, rushing to get out. Tim rushed in, grabbed the box, dropped it in the sink, and doused the flames. Outside, both my mom and my son were having full-on asthma attacks. When Eileen and I were able to get my mom and my son calmed down and breathing, we speculated as to why the stove would have been turned on when it is never used. Tim stated very simply, "You burn my pictures, I will burn you." A sick parting gift from a bad old soul. At long last, the 14 hours of flying non-stop from Singapore to London was over. Max managed to get the key to his hotel room. The thought of having 2 days off in London overcame the trauma he endured during the 16 hours of duty time. The flight was packed with demanding passengers, and it was hard coping with his senior crew. After having a shower, Max took a train from Gloucestershire Station and left for Piccadilly Station, the nearest tube station to London Chinatown. Max's favorite duck rice was in a restaurant in Chinatown. He would never fail to visit Chinatown for his favorite dish. The restaurant was crowded with diners from all over the world. It was noisy too. There was only one small table available, and the waiter ushered Max to that table. Chinese tea was served, and before Max could sip his tea, an old haggard-looking lady of European descent sheepishly asked Max whether she could share the table. Max gestured her to only the left seat. She took a bow and thanked Max. The old lady and Max had placed their dinner order, and it took a long time before their dinner was served. While waiting for their meals, Max and the old lady did not speak to each other, except for the occasional smile they exchanged with each other. After dinner, the old lady was pleasantly surprised when Max paid for her meal. She insisted on paying Max, but Max politely declined to accept. During the time when they were waiting for their dinner to arrive, Max noticed that the old lady was dressed in old tattered clothing. The dress was old and patched up, but it looked clean. She had an old, worn-out handbag. Max took pity on the old lady and decided to pay for her £5 dinner, which was nothing more than a plate of fried rice. After all, Max told himself that the allowances he earned on his London flight was more than $1,000. That night, Max was woken up from his sleep by some noises which sounded like someone talking to him. He looked up, and in the dim room light, could see an old lady seated across from his bed in a chair, smiling at him. Max noticed it was the same old lady who had shared his table at Chinatown. At this point, Max could feel the goosebumps all over his body. He was scared stiff, but the old lady lifted up her hands, smiled, and vanished into the thin air. Max could not sleep and remained so until dawn. Back at Singapore a week later, Max found out that his wife was pregnant. They had always wanted a baby, but Max's wife could not conceive. They have been married for a couple of years, and the knowledge that his wife was pregnant was indeed good news. The following news his wife was pregnant, Max also won a big sum of money by betting on lotteries. Indeed, Max and his wife suspected the old lady whom Max met in London must have given them good luck. Three years ago, I used to study in France, and I worked part-time at a restaurant in winter. This is a very old restaurant and an expensive one. My job was to clean the whole restaurant before it was noon. So every day early in the morning, around 5 a.m., I used to start my job, and it would take around 2 hours to complete. I like to share the strange experiences I had in this place. In the morning, when I'd start work, it was always dark. Every day, the first thing I did when I entered the place was to lock the door from the inside. After this, I turned off the alarm systems and then would turn on the heating systems. Each and every window was kept closed in the building. The restaurant opened at noon, so all the other employees started work after 11 a.m. I mention this to prove that there was no possibility of someone else entering the place from outside playing a role in my experiences. While working there most of the time, I got the feeling I wasn't alone. I remember many instances where I suddenly turned back because I would feel as if someone was behind me, a feeling of thin air brushing me. Most often, I got confused, but never got scared, maybe because I didn't have much time to think about it. When I worked upstairs, the building is 2 stories. Sometimes I heard footsteps coming from downstairs, or heard someone running up or down the staircases, and at those times, I come to the ground floor to see if my boss or the chef had come. Only 3 of us had a key, but strangely enough, not even once they were present. The next thing I did when it happened was run towards the main door and see if it was locked properly, and it was always locked. Those times, I just eased my mind, telling myself maybe I didn't hear anything. Since no one ever told me about the building's haunted history, I never wanted to believe there were paranormal presences. Other than this, sometimes I heard doorknobs turning. At times, strange sounds from the kitchen were heard, but whenever I checked, nothing was there. This building had some particular locations where it got so cold even though the heating systems were on. When you are at those places, you tend to get the feeling someone or something is always there, and it never moves from there. One of the creepiest places was the huge cellar in the basement. I had to visit the basement often to refill wine. The cellar and the basement were unusually cold. I often felt humming kinds of sounds from the cellar. It is hard to explain how, since these sounds were not heard, but felt. I worked in that place for 3 months, and in all those 3 months, I had noticed lots of strange things happening. My instincts were saying to me all the time that there were entities in that place which never belonged to our world or dimension. Regardless of that, I dismissed this instinct every time. I also need to say, I never ever experienced something which threatened me. If I saw something as a threat, maybe I would have quit my job. Now, sometimes I think that what I did back then by rejecting or neglecting the presence of paranormal entities, I saved myself from lots of unwanted haunting, which might have disrupted my lifestyle. I strongly believe that the fact I never showed any weakness was the main reason I was not harmed or threatened. After 3 months of work, I found a better job which suited my education, so I decided to leave my job. Something happened on the last day of my work which changed my whole attitude towards that building. It was a conversation with a barmaid who was working there for more than a year. The last day, I was waiting for my boss outside the restaurant to get my last pay and bid goodbye. It was almost 11:30 a.m., and one of the barmaids, Sophia, was already there. Since I had the key, I opened the restaurant door for her, and she went in. While I was outside, within 15 minutes, she came back running outside, and I could see she had a pale and panicked face. She sat next to me, and I could see from her looks she was terrified. She lit a cigarette and started smoking. I asked her what was wrong. She replied to me, "It's as usual. The things inside scared me." I was confused hearing this and asked her what she meant. She looked at me with a puzzled face and said, "Don't you know? Ghosts." And said she heard the usual footsteps and voices. She also said she felt as if someone touched her shoulder from behind. At this point, I noticed she was sweating like hell. I remind you it was winter and freezing even with thick jackets on. Once I saw this, I knew for sure she was damn serious about it. I tried to calm her down and told her that I too had experienced these things, but I never took it seriously and that I never accepted the ghostly presence inside. She said I was lucky I wasn't harmed. She was also shocked to hear that I usually start work as early as 5 a.m. In fact, even my boss didn't know I start work that early. I had to finish work before noon, and they thought I started work at 10 or 11 a.m. If someone had known the timetable I used for my conveniences, I'm sure they would have never allowed me. According to Sophia, throughout its history, the building was notorious for haunting. It was believed ghosts belonged to various centuries were present in that place, and also some other entities as well. People believe the presence of alcohol, food, and other luxuries were the reasons for this building being a hotspot for haunting. The building had always been a restaurant, a hotel, or a bar in its lifetime. Some people would flood to this place to have fun, and it seems the souls of those who never saw light still visit this building. There were also some ghosts who were trapped inside the building for unknown reasons. Most of these employees and guests, when being alone, have felt the presence of these ghosts. This includes voices, touches, and moving shadows. Sophia also mentioned that a murder or a suicide had taken place in the basement long ago. She wasn't sure about it, but said the basement had the strongest sightings. Some employees were working inside the basement and had seen moving shadows and strange whispers in their ear. Unlike the voices heard, these whispers were very clear. After my conversation with her, I really felt terrified, but also lucky to not have been threatened by ghosts. Now, Sophia was only 18 and was one of the fun-loving people in that restaurant who loved playing small jokes, so it was possible that she was trying to fool me. So that afternoon when I met another employee, Adela, who's a friend and was someone respectable in her 60s, I told her about my conversation with Sophia, and this old lady friend confirmed everything Sophia said. She also yelled at me for working so early alone in that building. She said the ghosts were very violent sometimes, and she mentioned an incident. One day when Adela, my boss, and another employee were having their last drink for the day, almost around midnight, suddenly they heard huge bangs and very loud noises from the kitchen. She said it sounded like someone was screaming out of anger. They were all scared because the whole place was locked from the inside, and there weren't others present in the restaurant but these three. Then after around 5 minutes, once everything had calmed, the three of them together with some people from a neighboring hotel had gone to the kitchen to see what had happened. She said the food trolley kept in the kitchen had banged the door for the rear entrance of the restaurant, which was through the kitchen. In the rear, there was a small garden, followed by a huge wall. The door was locked. It had occurred to them that something had been banging the trolley against the door. What frightened them was the kitchen knives, which were very sharp, were seen scattered around the kitchen as if someone had thrown them all over the place. Had some employee been present at the kitchen when this happened, then most probably he would have died or severely gotten injured. After this incident, my boss had brought a priest and purified the place, and things have calmed down a bit for some time. Then everything had started up again. Luckily, the kitchen haunting had never repeated. The year was 1980, and I was 14 years old. My parents and two younger sisters were living in Saudi Arabia, where my father was stationed as part of a phone system upgrade project for the kingdom. The school for expatriates, Americans, British, Canadians, and others from all over the world, only went up to grade 9 in Saudi Arabia. And so for the grade 10 school year, I was sent back to Canada to live with my grandmother in a small Ontario town, not far from Ottawa. My grandmother lived alone, my grandfather having died long before I was born. She was very religious and very involved with her church community, along with her regular Sunday attendance. My family didn't practice any religion and never went to church, so it took some time getting used to on my part being away from my family for the first time, living in a small rural town and living in a religious household. Further complicating things, I inadvertently crossed the school bully early on in the school year and found myself a pariah at the local high school where I was the new kid. To be exact, I had a hard time adjusting to this environment, and as a result, I stopped going to school. This upset my grandmother deeply, and she sent me to go see a doctor who prescribed me some kind of antidepressant. I just threw the entire bottle out the window. Drug me was not the solution. I would take my bike and go to the library or find a park on a nice fall day and read books. At night, I would stay up and watch late night TV like The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. The apartment was on the second floor of a house by the railroad tracks on the north edge of town. It was old and musty, and the floorboards and steps up creaked. There was only one entrance to the place, and if anyone came in, I would be able to see them coming up the stairs and pass by the living room where I watched TV. One night in November, I heard my grandmother sobbing from her room, which was down the hall. I knew I was the reason for her distress because I had stopped going to school and she didn't know how to deal with me. Then I heard her talking. At first I thought she was talking to herself, as this was 1980 and there were no cell phones and she did not have a phone in her room. The only phone was in the hall and she wasn't in the hall. Then a man's voice responded to her. "Don't worry, Anna," he said. Chills ran up my spine and I froze in my chair. The voice was deep and clear and in the house, and yet I had been in the living room all evening and no one had come into the house. I heard her sobbing some more, and one more time the voice spoke. "Everything will be all right." I remained in that chair until dawn. I'll never know if that was my imagination, my grandmother speaking in a different voice to herself, or perhaps, as I imagined at the time, it was the voice of my grandfather's spirit comforting my grandmother. Whatever the case, I've never forgotten that moment, nor the feeling of creepy dread that crawled up my spine, as something from the other world seemed to pass into this one for the moment. This is an experience that occurred over several months. In the autumn of 2012, I was home from university one weekend. On the outskirts of my town, there is an old graveyard called the Red River Cemetery. It is very old. The earliest graves are from the 1790s and associated with an abundance of local history. The Great Revival of 1800 occurred there, the first camp meeting in Christian history. A lot of spiritual activity happened at that event. This cemetery is a regular spot for me. It is a pleasant drive into the fresh country, and the entire graveyard is surrounded by ancient trees. In the back of the cemetery is a reconstruction of a log church that was once there. You feel as if you are going back in time when you go there. It is serenely silent and still, and there is a nostalgia with all the graves and arrangement of trees. In the center of the cemetery is a separate walled graveyard. It is an elaborate family plot, and the old wall dates back to the 1830s. There are many graves in there, and one has sunken in and opened. Vandalism or other natural occurrence? Not entirely sure. I walked around the plot for a few moments. I had come here many times before, and nothing strange had ever happened. But this time, I felt an unpleasant feeling. It wasn't very strong, but I felt that I should get out of this plot. I did so and continued to walk around the cemetery. Then it started that night. I mostly had insomnia, but I did drift into sleep eventually. The line between the two is blurred, but I definitely know that I was awake most of the night. In lack of a better term, my mind was tormented. Seemingly out of nowhere, my mind burned with the image of these two particular graves in the back of the walled plot. It was scorched in my mind. I had nightmares when awake of these two graves, and never could I get my mind off of them. It was something I've never experienced before. The thought and image of these graves blared and blared in my mind, and I felt terrified. I knew I was awake, and I was afraid in my own home. I felt I wasn't alone. I covered myself in the middle of my bed with this torturing thought of these two graves. As the night wore on, the thought or nightmare, I can't recall which, I had a dream of the people buried there. I remember specifically seeing a man, young, but I couldn't tell how young, and his face was a blur. He wore brownish beige clothes, pre-1850-ish style. He may have held pale hair, but I can't recall specifically. He was a little heavyset, not fat, just big. This image is crystal clear in my mind, and in my torment, I knew it was one of the people buried in those graves. This incident was absolutely dreadful. The next day, I was emotionally disturbed. My parents didn't know what to think. If I thought about my experience, I would start to cry. A few odd things happened that can be attributed to coincidence, but nevertheless odd. My dog was barking at nothing. Then the washing machine went crazy and started moving. The repairman said a part inside had gotten loose. It never done that, nor has it again. Again, this could be coincidence. Eventually, I put it out of my mind. It was disturbing, but I couldn't let it get in the way of my studies, so I carried on with my life. Then came the spring of 2013. I became curious again about those graves. I wondered, just who are buried in those graves? I thought if I found out, some sort of mystery would be solved or a question would be answered. So I gathered my courage and went back to the cemetery. I found the two graves. They were there. I wrote down the names but misplaced the exact information, but the individuals were two siblings. There was a Jane, and she passed away when she was 28 and had 3 children. Her brother's name was Chatham. He died when he was 21 or 22 in the 1810s. They were the children of a Kentucky senator, who is also buried nearby, and the site of their old family home is nearby. Nobody special, and I thought little of it. That very night, I woke up at exactly 3:30 a.m. Insomnia again. I had been awake for a few moments, and then my doorknob wiggled. I stared wide-eyed at it for the longest time. It had just wiggled. My first thought is that it was my cat. Sometimes she opens the porch door, then tries to open our doors. I prayed to God, please let that have been my cat, then I can sleep in peace. I convinced myself it was my cat, of course. The next morning, my cat was on the porch, and the porch door happened to be locked. Kitty had not snuck in, so I interrogated my mom, dad, and brother. They denied my accusations. They wouldn't do that. Then, the next night came, and I awoke again at 3:30 or 4:30. When I went to bed, my brother, who was in the den, right outside my room, was watching TV. But here, I was awake again, and I could see the light coming in, where I could see under the door. Then my door opened. I heard the doorknob turn, and it slowly opened, about halfway. Then it began to close again, but didn't close all the way. Then there was a flash of light in the den, and it went dark. I stared at it for a while. I thought it was my brother, because I thought he stayed up all night watching the show and opened my door for some reason. Thus, I wasn't scared, and I got up and closed the door. I attempted to go back to sleep, but was a little bothered. I asked him about it the next morning. He didn't know what I was talking about, because he swore he went to bed at midnight, and he has no history of sleepwalking. I did my usual interrogation, and everyone denied it. I was ambushed and became frightened. Later that day, I was on the computer and heard my mom scream my name twice, as if from outside, like she needed help. I rushed outside to get her aid. She was calmly tending the garden. She looked startled when I got there. "What's wrong?" I asked out of breath. "I heard you scream my name." She said she never did, and looked at me like I was crazy. She thought I was playing a joke on her. She'd never play a joke like this on me. Since this moment, nothing has happened with the incident. I even went back to the graveyard and got no bad feelings. It was a lovely autumn noon. Me, my parents, and my granny were on our way to visit relatives. Everyone was a bit on edge, as these family gatherings tend to be extremely awkward and competitive, so they thought it was the perfect time to express their views on political matters, which is always so delightful. For these reasons, I was rather annoyed when we arrived at the cemetery. Our final destination was visiting live relatives, although visiting dead ones can be competitive as well, as our culture has a knack of graveside landscape design. But my granny also wanted to pay our respects to the deceased, because she can't go there by herself too often. I used this opportunity to keep my distance and to gather my wits before standing in front of the grand jury on matters of finance and romance. I raked the leaves and started looking about. I was pleasantly surprised to notice I felt at ease. Previously, I've always felt uncomfortable in graveyards, jumpy even. I started looking around, observing the old, shadowy trees, leaves swirling down. There are mossy graves with old German names, barely possible to read now, Lithuanian names. It's close to the border. Sometimes I would notice a name I have heard, probably from local gossip. I was mostly enjoying the nature, though. At that point, I think it's important to admit, I felt anxious and a bit depressed because of the visit, but the graveyard felt to me like a park. Graves, just like some monuments dedicated to soldiers. However, when we were about to leave, I approached the graveside, almost from behind. Suddenly, I thought to myself, a young girl. Then I got scared because I didn't know if it was really a young girl. I rarely visit there, and I've consciously memorized just our family spot. A few graves around it, and some grave with, I think, Lithuanian names on the way in, because it is so close to the path, you almost step on it, and that makes me feel bad. The more I tried to brush the impression off, the more persistent it got. I don't really know how to explain it. The kind of presence I felt was like, it wasn't even physical. Let me give you a clear picture here. You are hanging out with your friends, watching a movie, laughing about this or that. Suddenly, someone says, "Oh, it's too bad John isn't here." And you feel like it would just be the perfect time if John was here, like he is truly missing at your party. That is the kind of presence I'm speaking about. You don't miss John's appearance. It's such a pity he's not here. The sofa looks awful without him. You don't miss any particular quality, You miss his presence, his being. That is what I felt. Like there was this presence of a particular young girl that I felt. It wasn't threatening or anything. I just got freaked out by my own old self. Then I also noticed, or perhaps before, I can't place these two in order because maybe that directed my attention to the grave, that a candle had fallen off the edge of the gravestone, and I felt I should have probably picked it up and placed it back. There was this little angel figurine too, and I thought maybe that was why I decided it was a young person. Although, I'm not sure I saw it from where I was coming. I don't know why. People just don't place angels on the graves of adults and elderly. Maybe it's because jobs and wrinkles don't seem angelic and old people mostly don't like flying. Sorry, couldn't resist a joke. I approached the front and counted the numbers that added up to 23 years. A girl. The graveside was neatly raked, not just raked to sweep away the footsteps from the sandy oil. Someone had even made ornaments in the sand in the traditional manner. I thought it was a perfectly good practical reason not to get involved. I was scared to do something awfully wrong and cause something terribly bad. I didn't want to ruin someone's thorough work, so I started stepping away slowly, having that internal fight with myself. I knew I had to go and put that candle back, but I told myself, come on, it will fall off again when it gets windy. Who cares? The candle's probably burnt out anyway. This isn't an abandoned grave. Someone will come. The grave was cared for. I can't go around picking up everything. As I later explained to my friend, I was probably worried that when you go to heaven, you still have to be preoccupied with order. I'm messy and I've been persecuted all my life for that. I hope when we die, we don't care anymore about such nonsense. I don't want anyone to visit me in my dreams, telling me to clean up under my bed. Finally, I rather unwillingly went back and placed that candle on the stone. I prayed to God to take care of this young soul and to protect me because I mostly had no idea what I was doing, so God had to take care of me. And as I walked back to the car, I suddenly felt really happy and warm around my shoulders. It wasn't a jolly kind of happiness, more like this, all is right kind of happiness. And it stayed with me until we found out my cousin had lost a lot of weight, which made everyone feel plenty of things. Thank you kindly for reading this experience. P.S. My granny saw me by the girl's grave, and she told us about her. It was some kind of tragic, unexpected death. I'm saying this because it might be that she had told me this before. The girl had died several years ago, as the grave was on the way out, and maybe I had unconsciously memorized it. It would be honest to mention this option. I just started experiencing whatever is going on, and it is really scaring me. A few weeks ago, my sister and I went to the local graveyard to test out this ghost radar I got in the app market for my droid. That's my phone, if you didn't know. I didn't think it would really work. It's just a circle with lines around it and a scanner, and if there is a so-called apparition nearby, a dot appears on the scanner in the direction it is. There was a slight breeze that day, and it was sunny. We got near the graveyard, and the scanner started going crazy. Dots were appearing everywhere, red, yellow, and green dots. The colors meaning the strength of the so-called entity, red being the most present and green being the least. A word or phrase appears at the top of the screen sometimes, like something to do with their death and whatnot. A large amount of phrases and words began appearing, some names and some frightening words like hanged or murder. The creepiest part of the whole equation was when a name appeared. The name was Peter. My sister and I started wondering if the Peter that appeared was an inhabitant of the graveyard. We started looking at gravestones, and we actually found one that said Peter Longs. It was a little scary, but then again, there is a lot of people named Peter in this world. We started talking to the so-called spirits. Like I said, is there anyone here with us that would like to share things via my radar? I started getting replies like crazy. Random words and phrases were blazing around like a wildfire. We then started to go home because it was getting near dinner time. Everything was good from then on for about 2 days. My whole family started hearing footsteps, knocks, bangs, etc. My sister said that she heard her name called, and then a bottle of her perfume flew off of her shelf and across the room. I later started seeing shadows and hearing muffled talking in the room next to me, even when nobody would be in there. Everything was starting to scare me, so I spoke out to them and told whatever was plaguing my family that it had to leave my home. Everything was quiet and back to normal until the next night, when I was laying in bed trying to sleep. I felt really cold, all of a sudden, and my TV turned on really quick, and then it turned off again. I went to my sister's room and saw her sitting up in her bed, looking really frightened. I asked her what was the matter, and she said that her TV turned on and off again. I told her that the same thing happened to me. We were both scared as can be, so I just slept in her room that night. The most recent and scariest experience I have was when I was home alone one night because my family was out at the store and I didn't want to go. I was just watching TV, and then the channel flipped. The remote was all the way across the room when that happened. Later, I got in the shower, and as I was washing my hair, I heard a knock on the bathroom door. The door swung open, and one of the knobs in the cabinet hanging on the wall fell to the floor. I was so scared that I called my mom, and I went to my neighbor's house until they got home. But are these experiences attributed to me going to the graveyard recently? I don't know, but I'm really terrified of all these events that occurred. But I guess in a way, it is kind of entertaining. Not in a good way, but an interesting one. Thanks for reading. I've lived in New Mexico my entire lifetime and never moved. As a result of living in the center of the Southwest, I've heard the story of Llorona multiple times and in many different versions. I live very close to about 2 rivers, and when I was little, I heard a version of the story where she drowned her children in the river that I could easily walk to. I never thought I would pay much attention, nevertheless see her, hear her, and slightly see, but recently, all that changed. I have 3 friends that are brother and sister to each other. It was summer of 2008 and we were having a sleepover. We had been planning this for about a month, and earlier in the day, we had bought all the food and other snacks we could imagine. We had planned to fire up the grill and make s'mores at about 8 p.m. and just sit outside and have a good time. At every sleepover we have, it seems that the Halloween decorations seem to get taken out of the closet a lot. 8 p.m. came around and we made s'mores in the front yard. It was fun, seeing as I was the first, second, third, and last to set mine on fire. We walked around barefoot in the driveway for a bit. I set the skull on the wall of our patio. After a bit, we sat in front of the door, talking silently. During a small moment of silence and nothing to say, we heard a moan come from up the hill. It sounded outside and very close, but still far away. We ran inside, and in the haste, I nearly got shut out. We were all accounted for, and we ran into my room. When we heard it, it seemed like it was coming our way fast. We all believed it was Llorona, but we shook it off as one of my neighbors trying to scare us. The 2 streets we lived on had ex-criminals and people with mental disorders everywhere. I eventually noticed that I didn't have the plastic skull with me. About 2 or so hours later, I walked through the dark hallway, switching on as many lights as possible right when I was in my entryway. I looked out the narrow window next to the front door. I saw what looked like a misty shape of a person hovering there. It kind of looked like a woman, but I couldn't tell very easily. It was all very light. I didn't stay to find out. I turned tail and ran back to my room. Right before I got to running half of the 2 feet into the hallway, I looked down a bit and saw my plastic skull right next to the door. I'm still not sure if that really was Llorona, but one of the friends at the sleepover, the older sister, had heard once before, and the moaning sounded just the same, and she heard her. The other sister with us was hearing bells for the rest of the night. This story goes way back before I was born. My uncle told us the story on one Christmas day, when I was like 7 years old. He told us that when he and his work friends went to a bar to relax after a hard day at work, he saw the scariest thing in his entire life. When he got near to the ravine, he saw a lady in white weeping and crying looking down, standing at the edge of the ravine. So he said, "Are you okay? Be careful, you're going to fall." But no words came out of her. My uncle described her. He said she was wearing a long white dress and she had no feet, actually floating in the air. He could only see her back. After a few seconds, my uncle felt really bad and he started backing up. Her weeping became louder and louder. Then she turned around and my uncle screamed. Her face was indiscernible, and she had horse legs. She was part human and part animal. After that, he never walked home alone at midnight around the ravine. He said that, at night, he could hear her weeping soft in the air, and he still gets the chills down his spine. People say that when you hear the weeping lady far, far away, she is right outside your house or near you, and when you hear her really close and loud, it's because she is far away. My mom is a first-generation American. Her parents moved from Mexico to El Paso, Texas, before she was born. The supernatural was very prevalent in both sides of her family. My grandfather claims that we are descended from the Apache warlord Victorio, and that the spirit of Victorio appeared to him and his brothers when he was a young man. My mom had many experiences with ghosts and spirits, but she said that none was more terrifying than her experience with La Llorona. Her family lived in a decent-sized house on the banks of a canal on the south side of El Paso. At the time, the family had 3 dogs. My mom describes all of them as the toughest dogs in the block. One night in the dead of winter, my grandfather was telling my mom one of his great stories when there was a loud commotion in the front yard where the dogs were. The dogs were barking to wake the dead. My mom and her dad went outside into the front to see what was going on. They were joined by my grandmother. They had not noticed this before, but a fog was slowly creeping around the street. The air was chill, but different from the cold of winter. The cold went down to the very bone. The 3 dogs were barking towards the fog, or more accurately towards the canal that was by the house. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night air. My mom described it as the most terrifying cry she has ever heard in her entire life. She says that it lasted for a full minute before finally dissipating. When the scream left, the fog lifted and the dogs returned to the way they were before. My mom asked her dad what the scream was, but all he said was La Llorona and told her to go back to bed. Naturally, she couldn't sleep and instead listened to her parents debate over whether or not to call the cops and report her murder or something. In the morning, when it was light out, my grandfather went down to the canal but unsurprisingly found nothing. When he came back, he told my mom the legend of the woman who drowned her own children and is now fated to cry out for them on the banks of the river where she killed them. And to this day, my mom is convinced that she heard La Llorona on that night so many years ago. Another close associate of mine who has had a close encounter with La Llorona is my former karate instructor and confirmation class teacher. He is Irish and a devout Catholic, but firmly believes in the existence of ghosts and the paranormal. When he was a teenager, he lived in New Mexico, close to the borders with Texas and Mexico. Like any good teenager looking for a rush, he liked to ride around with his brothers after dark and watch for ghosts in the old graveyards. One night, he and his brothers managed to convince a couple of girls they were sweet on to come along. They were sitting in the car in the middle of the desert when a deep fog started setting in. They were unsettled and decided to leave, but the car wouldn't start. Suddenly, he says that everything went completely and utterly pitch black. My friend flipped, but his brothers were frozen in their seats, unable to move a muscle. He yelled, but they still didn't move. He reached over and managed to finally start the car. He was 15 and didn't even have a license, but he drove out of there like a bat out of hell. When his heart finally stopped racing, he stopped the car. He turned to his brother and asked him what the hell happened back there. His brother, with his face still white, asked him incredulously, "Jim, did you not see her?" He shook his head no and asked his brother what he was talking about. His brother told him that when everything had gone black, a strange translucent white woman appeared outside of the car. She looked like a wicked witch. She reached her hand into the car, through the closed window for Jim's neck, but stopped and drew back when she touched it. She then disappeared, and that was when the car started. Jim reached up to his neck and fingered the St. Michael medal he always wore. He firmly believed that the archangel responsible for defeating Satan protected him on that night. Whatever the spirit was, a demon, Llorona, or some other frightful specter does not matter. Jim is firmly convinced that it was Llorona, and that she was stopped from whatever evil she intended, and he never stops praying to St. Michael. Hi, my name is Michelle. I'm a mother of 4 children, but when this happened, I only had 2. My oldest was 5, my youngest was just a baby. When my second child was about 4 months old, we lived in a trailer park across the street from an open field in Sodus Point, New York. It was supposedly a battlefield in the War of 1812. One night, around midnight, he woke up crying. I heard someone or something singing, or rather chanting to him. It sounded so weird. I couldn't understand her, but she kept singing until he went back to sleep. This proceeded to happen every time he woke up in the middle of the night, up until the night before we moved. Needless to say, he slept with me every night. I was really scared that something would happen to him. I never figured out what it was. Some people tell me it was the ghost of a slave, and other people say it might have been the ghost of a nurse. Yet, other people said it could be the ghost of Llorona. She threw her children into the water and drowned them and was condemned to walk the earth until she finds her children. She supposedly steals babies in the night trying to make up for the children she murdered. It still scares me. It was the weekend after Thanksgiving, Saturday, around 3 a.m. 2011. My sister and I were watching movies on Netflix, enjoying our days off due to the holiday. Everyone was sleeping because, after all, it is very early in the morning. All of a sudden, we began to hear a moaning or crying coming from a woman. It was very loud and it was terrifying. It sounded ugly, like a woman in pain or despair. It went on for about 20 seconds, then it stopped for 10 to 15 seconds. Then it began again, even louder. Told my sister to grab the phone to be ready to call the police because I thought a woman was being raped or being assaulted near our house. I stepped outside, scared, to see if I could prevent a crime. Shouldn't have done that, could have been dangerous. When I got to the front of the house, there was no one outside, yet the crying was literally in front of me. It was a foggy night as well. My sister came out, and the crying lasted for about 2 minutes. We were puzzled. We looked at each other, and we both got chills. We were both thinking the same thing. I don't want to come to any conclusions. I'm Hispanic and grew up with the legend of Llorona. Many people in the Hispanic community swear that that malevolent spirit does exist, and even say they have heard the cries in their native countries and in Southern California. I'm not sure what I believe in regarding paranormal activity and such, but I do have an open mind and like to do as much research as possible before making any firm decisions. This experience happened in November of 2010, a month after having my youngest. I just had a procedure to remove a kidney stent 2 or 3 days prior. I was sick almost right after leaving the hospital and felt horrible, but it was my first time going under anesthesia, and a nurse had told me it was common to feel ill. I was running a low-grade fever about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The baby had awoken for a 2 a.m. feeding, and I was holding him standing in the living room in front of the heater. I was chilled to the bone because of the fever, and feeling a bit dizzy. I thought, oh geez, I'm going to cook the baby. Just then, about 5 feet away from me, appeared this man. He was tall, over 6 feet, buff large muscles, a stern face. He wore old brown looking clothes. It reminded me of stories of fur trappers out on the frontier. Maybe it was animal skin, but I'm not sure. He had the same style satchel that crossed his body. The strap on one shoulder and the satchel rested almost on the opposite hip. He had long brownish hair and brown wings that went almost to the floor. He was standing beside me, one of the dining room chairs that was pushed away from the table with one foot on the seat. He did not smile, but I wasn't afraid of him, surprised for sure. But instead of freaking out, I just said a muffled hello, and then he disappeared. I felt like I needed to sit and cautiously sat on the chair his foot was on, saying, I'm sorry if you were using this chair, but I need to sit. I thought later, maybe that's why he was there. I was holding a baby with a fever and standing too close to the heater. Maybe he wanted me to sit, but I also understand that I was ill and it could have been some sort of fever hallucination. I did many internet searches trying to find out who this was, but I found nothing that matched. I suppose I was wondering if anybody else has ever seen a man like this, or may know who he is. Thank you for your time. I hope I described him well, but let me know if there are any further questions. So when I was younger, about 11, my family and I lived in a 2-bedroom trailer. We had a small little hallway coming from the living room to the main room. My mom is Christian, and she listens to a Christian music radio station, and we would listen most of the time in car rides. Keep this in mind. In the room I shared with my brother, our feet were pointing towards the door which showed you out to the hallway. If you were to go to the left, you would go into the living room, and if you'd go to the right, to my parents' room. This one night, I woke up in the middle of the night randomly. I looked up towards my feet and saw a slightly tall man singing a song I knew I had heard in that radio station before. He just sang and stared at me, but his voice was so beautiful. I don't think Zahn or anyone else could sing just like he did. Also keep in mind, my dad wasn't home at the time. He was in jail. So the man started walking out into the hallway and walked towards the living room. I was not scared. I was more mystified of the man's presence. I got up and went to my room and asked her if she had seen the man, and she said no, and so I explained to her that he was singing the song on the radio station. I don't remember the name or how it sounds. Up to this day, I firmly believe that it was an angel watching over my family and I. My grandma has gone to explain that the way you know it's an angel is if you don't feel anything but peaceful, and if it's a demon, that you get bad chills and are scared to the max. This story didn't happen to me, but it happened to my sister. In our town, there is a bridge that is on a dirt road that is said to be haunted. It's called Hollow Bridge. They say a couple were murdered, and the wife still comes around every night about 2 a.m., which is the time they died. This was about 100 years ago, or so I am told. Do I believe this story? Not really, but I'll go with it. They also say that if you are there at night and you see her, she will tell you something you don't want to know. When I was 15 and my sister was 17, I've seen something. One night, my sister, her boyfriend, my boyfriend at the time, and myself were all there around 2 a.m. It was a very clear night. Well, all of a sudden there was a fog that was rolling up to the bridge from the tree line, about a quarter mile back. I couldn't believe my eyes, so I freaked out and we left. So forward a year, my sister, who at that time had a different boyfriend, had called me bawling her eyes out. After she calmed down, she said that the hollow woman told her she would die on the hollow, which is a very dangerous road since it was not paved and it was very narrow. I told her to calm down and that it was just her imagination. She would be fine. A few nights later, we shared a room. We were sleeping and she woke me up out of a dead sleep from her crying. I woke her up annoyed and asked her what her deal was. She told me my grandmother, who neither of us met since both grandmothers passed away before we were born, had come to her in her dreams, telling her that one day she'll need her and she'll be there to protect her. At that point, I was kind of freaked out, but I dismissed it, telling her she needed to go to bed. 2 weeks after the dream, about 5 p.m., my brother comes rushing over to my friend's house, which was right behind our house, crying, and kept saying, "Amber, Amber, Amber." My sister, being a very rebellious child and into bad things with bad people, I asked, okay, what did she do now? It wasn't new that she had gotten picked up by the cops. He said she's in the hospital and that she was in a bad car accident on the hollow. I felt my color drain from my body. It felt like my soul left me. I dropped to my knees, remembering everything she had told me about the hollow and my grandmother. I knew at that time my mom, cousin, and oldest brother were rushing to the hospital and a half an hour away because she was life-flighted. I grabbed my 2 younger brothers and held on to them for dear life. Thinking I could lose my sister, I wanted to be as close to them as possible. The next 5 hours were hell to me, getting my brothers to sleep, trying not to cry while I waited for the phone call to know what happened. She had broke her neck, a hangman's fracture, along with her wrist and her upper arm, which went right through her elbow. The doctor said that she had a 30% chance of surviving the surgery, and if she did, she would be in a halo. Once she came out of surgery, if she survived the night, she would only have a 15% chance of ever walking again. The next morning, they took her out of the coma and she was talking and being her stubborn self. They realized that she was moving her feet and legs. We all cried. We couldn't believe that she had survived this and will walk again. The doctors say she had a guardian angel on her shoulder that night because there is no medical reason as to why she should have survived. Almost 10 years later, she has a beautiful 8-year-old little boy. Yes, still has problems with her neck and arm, but has never went down that road again. That road is now paved in certain areas, and a very strict speed limit is attached to it. But still, to this day, I say that she was warned, and she had a loved one at her side that day. Sorry this was so long. I hope you enjoyed the story. First, as far back as I can remember, I've always been fascinated with the paranormal. When I was around 8, I believe, I started seeing a blue lady out of my bedroom window. She always seemed to be walking towards our house. I thought maybe I was imagining things at the home. One night, I finally went outside to make sure it was something with my window, but I still saw her. When I came back in, I told my parents, who they said they saw glimpses of her going into my bedroom. Hearing that got me excited, like there was something special about me, but not long after I stopped seeing her. I do recall hearing my name a few times clearly, but no one was home. This blue lady had a majestic aura about her, a very serene, very peaceful and tranquil aura. I can't explain it more than that, but it just felt good, not like it was a bad presence or anything like that. Then one night, I had a dream where a lady in a white dress and long curly blonde hair looking like the lady in blue appeared out of nowhere. She had gave me a kiss on the cheek, and I woke with what felt like ice-cold lip marks on my cheek. After that incident, I had nothing paranormal happen again that I recall. Although my family says all paranormal activities quit as soon as I moved out, I happened to find this coin in my house that says Guardian Angel on it. This coin has followed me around for 18 years. There have been times I've lost it, but somehow found it randomly later on. Recently, I had lost it at my previous house and never found it. I recently happened to find it in a used car I purchased from a family friend within the time I've been at my current residence. I've had a few experiences in the last 6 years that are paranormal, but those stories, yeah, they're for another time. Thank you for reading this, and I hope that you may find comfort in the story. This all happened 6 years ago, when I was visiting my great-grandmother in the Free State. I've always been scared of the dark or sleeping alone, so I asked if I could sleep with my aunt, and she didn't have a problem. I'm 30 years old, by the way. The first night wasn't so bad, as I had the comfort that I wasn't alone in bed. I heard dragging footsteps in the kitchen and the door opening and closing, but was too afraid to wake up and investigate or wake my aunt up for something that's not there. I just laid there on the bed, listening to this thing in person, dragging feet around in the kitchen and opening and closing the doors between the dining room and kitchen. I ultimately fell asleep. The next morning, I asked my aunt if she'd heard anything, and she said no. The second night was what scared me the most. As we laid there sleeping, I just suddenly turned, and my eyes opened wide, and there, inside the wardrobe, I could see, since the door was half open, was a dark male figure with red eyes peeping through. Our eyes just met, and I couldn't scream or move. I just stared right back at those red eyes, and it spoke in Soto, South African language. It said, "I'm not here to scare you, but to scare that one," meeting my aunt, and I can't remember what happened after or how I fell back to sleep. I told my aunt about it, and we had to sleep with the light on for the rest of my stay. I still can't get the black figure with red eyes hiding in the wardrobe out of my head. The first strange experience I had was during my sister's 10th or 11th birthday party. At the time, my family lived in a house in a blue-collar town in New Jersey. The house was set up where the front door was, up a flight of stairs. Once inside, there was a landing that led to another flight of stairs upstairs and another leading to the lower level. Downstairs was a long hallway with a doorway leading to the garage. At the foot of the stairs, which formed one end of a long hallway, there was a closet under the stairs. There was a laundry room at the end of the hallway, and finally large living room. My sister had invited all of her friends, and everyone was having a good time. After eating cake, the grown-ups went upstairs for coffee, and the kids stayed downstairs to play on their own. At a certain point, we all decided to scare each other by telling ghost stories in front of the laundry room. My sister and I had always thought of it as the creepiest spot in the house, and it proved to be the perfect spot to tell ghost stories. When you opened the laundry room door, you stared down a long dark room with a shaded window at the end. The doorway to the laundry room was a small recess at the end of the hallway. The house quieted down as we started talking about scary things. After a few of those stories, everyone started to get into the spirit. My sister and I were sitting at the end of the hall, looking down its length. From our vantage point, we could see the wall along which the door leading to the garage was. We were midway into someone's ghost story when my sister suddenly noticed that the door leading to the garage had suddenly popped open just a bit. She remembered that the door was definitely locked. We walked over and closed the door and made sure to lock it again. By then, all of us were terrified and thoroughly petrified in our own little recess. As little kids, not one of us wanted to move out of our spot or make a noise. Just then, someone rang the doorbell, which made everyone jump 3 feet, but was enough to kill the moment. Everyone started laughing. Our house was new when we bought it, and nothing strange had ever happened to anyone in my family there. Now that we're older, my sister and I still bring up this incident with my sister, and we both have a good laugh. She still swears that she locked the door. Growing up, I spent a lot of time reading true ghost stories and still do. When we were little, my sister and I would borrow the ghost books from the library. The best were the ones with real pictures. I remember reading one of those ghost books when I was in middle school. It was right during the time when midterms or finals were coming up, and I had a pile of school books on my desk. A ghost book was tucked away there somewhere, and for a break, I'd pull out the ghost book. At the time, I was part of the school basketball team and proudly received my practice jersey, which I still have, that I kept hung on a hook at the back of my bedroom door. That night, I was studying for finals with the bedroom door closed. My desk faced the wall, and the door was 4 feet to the right. I had my Walkman on. Do you remember those things? And started getting into the rhythm of doing my English homework to the tunes of rap. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I was distracted by some movement. I looked up to see my jersey swinging back and forth on the hook. It looked just as if someone had tipped the hanger to one side with a finger, causing it to swing. Right away, I checked to see if the door was locked. Maybe my father had opened the door after I didn't hear him knocking. I didn't want to be bothered while studying, so it was logical that I would have locked it. When I checked, the door was definitely locked, and there was no noise behind the door. All the while, the jersey continued swaying back and forth, eventually stopping after losing speed. Next, I checked to see if the window was open, but it was November, and the windows were all closed to keep out the cold. Right before I noticed the jersey swinging, I just put down a very large, hard-covered dictionary onto the desk. The dictionary was about 10 inches long and 3.5 inches thick. I thought maybe it made a slight wind as I put it down, but no matter how many times I tried, I couldn't cause the jersey to move from 4 feet away. I didn't feel scared and just continued studying with the Walkman on. Nothing like this has ever happened again, but I can't explain what caused that jersey to swing. One of the most bizarre experiences I've ever personally had was with my family while staying at a hotel in Atlantic City, New Jersey. It happened around 1997, and I was lucky to have most of my family there to experience it with me. Atlantic City is an interesting location for strange experiences. The casinos draw many from the New York area and beyond, but along with this brings the good and bad of social ills that come along with games of chance. The summer of 1997 was a typical one. Like we did many summers before, my family drove down the shore to spend a few days enjoying the beach and casinos at Atlantic City. As usual, my father arranged the trip and found a new hotel with a very reasonable price. The name of the hotel is called the Flagship and is still located at the northern end of the boardwalk, far from the other casinos. After a long, cold winter, my family was anxious to see the ocean and asked the front desk for an oceanfront view. We were told that the only room available wasn't facing the ocean, but with 2 queen-size beds, the room was very comfortable and that we could see the ocean from the side of the balcony. It was the perfect size for my parents, my sister and I, and we agreed, and the man at the front desk gave us 2 door cards. Our room was on the 10th floor. Looking back, none of us recalled running into many guests in the hotel at all. However, we thought that since the hotel was new, it was just beginning to attract customers. Once we found our room, we used the room card to open the door and went inside. Right away, things went wrong. The room was very dark. The curtains for the sliding door to the balcony were pulled, and extremely cold. It was a typical hotel room, except for a small kitchen area right in front of 2 queen-size beds. At the foot of the second bed was a sofa bed. Then beyond the second bed, there was a sliding glass door leading to a small balcony. Although we were facing the interior of Atlantic City, just as the front desk mentioned, we could see the ocean on one side of the balcony. Very soon, we found out why the room was so chilly. The air conditioner, which was located on the wall above the sofa bed, was turned on full blast and wouldn't turn off. As I mentioned this to my father, I saw my mother fidgeting with the front door's electronic lock. Like she often said, and did, she checked to see if the door was locked when closed from the outside. It wasn't. Inside the door, there was a sticker that explicitly stated that the door was always locked on the outside. Not so. We also realized that the stove in the small kitchen wasn't working. Then we saw that there was a small leak coming from the mini fridge as well. My father called downstairs, and soon a repairman came up and fixed the AC, the stove, the refrigerator leak, and even the front door. He mentioned that the lock should always be locked from the outside and seemed puzzled by the device. We gave the man a big tip and then quickly made our way over to the casinos. When we arrived back to our room, well after dinner, we immediately felt how cold it was in the room and turned off the AC. After washing up, we watched some television before turning in. I remember one of the programs was about ghosts, and we watched that one for a while, not realizing what was to come. My mother and sister were the first to go to bed and turned off the lights. They slept in different beds, with my mother in the bed closer to the kitchen area and my sister in the one near the balcony. I stayed up reading on the kitchen table with the dim light on. I had some trouble falling asleep that night since the sofa bed mattress was new and was still covered in plastic. I must have felt lazy because I left it on and suffered because it was very hot and not very conducive to a good night's rest. At breakfast the next morning, my sister told us about something strange that happened during the night. All night long, she said she felt someone brushing past her bed as if trying to walk to the balcony door. At the foot of her bed, there was about a foot of space between her bed and the end of my sofa bed. She said it felt exactly like someone was squeezing through the tight space and rubbing against her bed. At first, she thought it was me trying to get outside the balcony. Then when she looked up, she saw my father and I still sitting at the kitchen table reading. At the time, none of us really believed her, and we went out again for a day of walking on the boardwalk and then gambling at night. That night, I stayed up later than everyone else. I talked to my sister about what she experienced the night before. I also told her to let me know if she felt it again. As soon as she got in bed, I sat down by the kitchen table to read, glancing over towards her bed every once in a while to see if anything happened. After a while, I gave up and continued reading before getting up to wash up in the bathroom. When I came out of the bathroom, my sister was sitting up in bed. She said that she again thought I had squeezed past the bed to go to the balcony, but then she opened her eyes and saw me come out of the bathroom at the other end of the room. I was positioned on the sofa bed so that my head was right next to the little space at the end of my sister's bed. If someone walked past, I would have surely felt something, but that night I didn't notice anything at all. As usual, it took a little bit of time for me to sleep. I listened intently and tried to feel any wind or changes in the room, but eventually gave up and slept. I had by then taken off the troublesome plastic cover and finally had a good night's rest. The next day, my father woke me up early to rent bikes for an early morning boardwalk ride. Then he went to my sister and woke her up as well. As soon as he did this, my mother, who planned to sleep in, suddenly sat up in bed and turned on the lights in the TV. We asked her why she didn't want to sleep, since it was still only about 5:30 a.m. She told us that she wasn't very tired and that she felt like waking up, which is unusual since she usually likes to sleep past 11. We all thought this was pretty odd. My mother loves to sleep late. She kept giving us vague reasons about why she wouldn't go back to sleep, and even turned on the television. Later on, she told us the reason why. At breakfast, my mother told us about the strange incident that happened that night. She had woken up in the middle of the night. It was late, and she could hear all of us either snoring or breathing the natural rhythms of a very good night's rest. She was sleeping on the right-hand side of the first bed and was lying on her side facing inwards, but gradually she realized that she felt the sensation of someone's back lying against her own. At first, she was convinced that it was my sister, but she was pretty alarmed to realize that my sister was in the other bed, 4 feet away. Slowly, without opening her eyes, she moved closer to my father. The feeling was very real, but very slowly, the other person's back gradually went away. My mother said that in the morning, she hadn't expected my sister to go riding bikes with us, leaving her all alone in the room. After we left, she tried her best to stay awake. She turned on all the lights and turned on the television, but eventually she fell asleep anyway. As my mother told us this story, my sister chimed in saying that the person walked past her bed all of last night as well. This time, though, she also felt her sheets being gently pulled away to the corner of the bed towards the balcony. For some reason, whenever she turned to face the balcony, it would stop. When she turned back around, she would feel the bed bulge a little, as if a person were rubbing past it. Also, she felt energy waves from the foot of her bed. After we came back to the room from breakfast, all of us were not so sure about our room anymore. Despite this, we still had a day of vacation and fun to look forward to. After we got what we needed, my father went downstairs early to get some brochures. Then my sister and I walked to the elevator while my mother got some last-minute things. We were both standing there by the elevator doors when we heard my mother anxiously calling us back to the room. When we got there, she looked a little shaken and said that the front door wouldn't lock from the outside again. She said that all the while, as she was rifling through her suitcase looking for something, she had a bad feeling and couldn't wait to get out of the room. Once safely outside, as an afterthought, she turned the handle to see if the door was locked from the outside. Once again, it wasn't locked. This time, we went downstairs instead of calling for a repairman. The front desk seemed puzzled about the lock. They said that the lock should always be locked from the outside. They were at a loss as how to fix it, and finally recommended that we get another room. Everyone felt very relieved, and we quickly gathered our things to get out of the room immediately. We got another room upstairs, and this time, our new room was perfect in every way. Not surprisingly, the rest of our trip was pretty relaxed, but we sometimes joked about what would happen to us if we stayed another night in that room. All of us agreed that there was something in that room that wanted to be left alone. It didn't want to scare us, but instead just gently showed us that we had to go. For some reason, my mother and sister feel that it was a child or a little boy. If this is true, perhaps something happened to the boy in the room. Everything seems to point to the balcony where things seem to emanate from. Perhaps the boy fell off the balcony, or maybe someone died in the room. Maybe the spirit felt an affinity to the woman, as opposed to my father and I, who didn't experience anything. The flagship is now a luxury timeshare condo. I'm not sure if it's still partly a hotel. While we were there, the hotel operators aggressively tried to sell us a timeshare, but of course, we turned them down every time. I wonder who bought the timeshare for that room on the 10th floor, and if anything similar happened to them. I have a brother who works in Hong Kong. Many of his clients are from this area in China. One of his clients was a Hong Kong businessman in his 40s. This client often went on frequent business trips to Shanghai and Beijing for his company. My brother was very familiar with this man, as were many other of the people working in my brother's office. My brother worked closely on him on several large projects, and they often made small talks during breaks. On one occasion, he told my brother that on one of his visits to Shanghai, He was staying in a hotel and had just returned to his room at night after a long day's work. He washed up, turned down the lights, and then got into bed. He had drifted off into an exhausted sleep when he was violently awakened in the dead of night. In the pitch darkness, he felt the ice-cold hands of a woman clasped around his neck, strangling him as he tried desperately to break free. After a few seconds, the hands finally let go, and the man jumped up and turned the lights on. As he scanned the room, he found himself absolutely alone. The room looked just as it had before he got into bed. Upon his return to Hong Kong, he was profoundly shaken by the incident and consulted with a very good fortune teller that his family knew well. The fortune teller told him that there was a woman following him around. He didn't know the reason, but that was the case. My brother's client was a businessman, and in spite of what had happened to him, scoffed at the idea of some mysterious ghost lady following him around. My brother and his client had a good laugh about this during their break. Still, my brother warned him to be careful and to make sure he was a gentleman to the lady ghost. A few months had passed before my brother heard what had happened to his client. Many of my brother's colleagues were talking about it in my brother's office when the topic came up. They had heard that the client had died in a hotel room in Shanghai. The cleaning lady had discovered his body in the room, alone and lying in bed. We sometimes wonder what really happened to this client. We wonder if he just died of natural causes, or if those cold hands returned during the night. If so, who was she? I don't know, but it's a strange story. When I was in my early 20s, a friend and I decided to rent a house together. We found a lovely old house near the Mississippi River, and I was immediately drawn to it. After we moved in, we both began to notice banging on the walls and lights blowing out constantly. The lights we attributed to bad wiring, and the banging, I truly believed, was my friend, and she truly believed it was me. The layout of the house was one we had never seen before. There was a hallway that led from the front living area to the back bedroom areas that was at an odd, slanted angle. I always felt uncomfortable going down this hallway and found myself going around by way of the kitchen. After months, my friend and I decided to take in a third roommate to help with expenses. During the next month or so, after this third roommate moved in, we noticed an increase in frequency to the noises, banging, and lights going out. We also began to notice that every month, and this is really weird, right around the time that all three of us began our menstrual cycles, a very large stain began to appear in the middle of our living room floor. We tried constant shampooing, but it would always reappear immediately. Then after our cycles were finished, the stain would disappear on its own, only to reappear the next month. Our third roommate then became very withdrawn after only a short time of being in the house. She began to go directly to her bedroom and never came out except to go to work. Her personality has also changed drastically. She went from being very funny and outgoing to a complete loner. She would also say very inappropriate, weird things to us. We had known this girl for some time, and her behavior was quite unsettling. She finally told us that she was not comfortable in this house and was moving out, and she did so that very day. Shortly after she moved out, the banging noise began in earnest, and we started noticing our things being rearranged. We began to laughingly and nervously admit to each other that something was not right in this house. However, neither one of us felt threatened by any kind of the weird happenings, and in fact, I personally actually felt almost protected by it. We started to call our ghost George, and would talk to him whenever the banging would begin. We were trying to watch something on TV, and George would start banging or knocking. We would say, "Please, George, not right now. We're trying to see this." And he would actually stop, at least until the show was over. Unfortunately, no matter how much we begged him to stop putting the stain on the floor every month, that never ended. In fact, it got bigger and darker the longer we lived there. One kind of amusing episode happened to us one memorable evening. I decided to let my boyfriend at the time stay overnight with me, although I usually didn't do this. Just as we were dozing off, a very loud bang sounded, coming from the hallway. My boyfriend sat up and asked, "What the heck was that?" Immediately, a knocking began at the far end of the hall and rushed towards my room very fast, knocking louder and louder the closer it came. My boyfriend said, "That has to be your roommate being funny." I just laughed and tried to explain about our ghost, and that I thought he might be angry that I had a male friend overnight. He said that was bull and got up to investigate. Just as he came to the hallway, the knocking began again, all around him. Needless to say, my brave 6'4" boyfriend ran straight out the front door and never came back in the house. Anyway, after a few years, my roommate and I decided we were going to move to a cheaper apartment, closer to where we worked. As soon as we started packing, the noises, and especially the lights going out, began to get really bad. I was even starting to get a little frightened. One day, as we were finishing up packing, we decided to go check in the basement and see if we had anything left down there. While we were down there, we decided to go in the old fruit cellar, since neither one of us had actually looked in it. We found some old fishing equipment. We also found an old shirt box that was sealed with tape and felt kinda heavy, so we brought it upstairs and opened it up. Inside was a bunch of old pictures. Most of the pictures were of a young man of about 25 or 30. In many of the pictures, he was in our house and standing on the porch of the house. There were also some antique glass slides with pictures of him in the military uniforms. We dated the stuff around World War II. We decided to call our landlady, an elderly woman, around 80 years old, to tell her we had found the box. When we called her and told her what we had found, she hung up on us. We called back, and her daughter answered and said that they didn't want that stuff anymore, and we could have it or throw it away. We thought it was very strange, since normally our landlady was a sweet old lady, so we decided that some of the stuff in the box might be worth more money, and we would sell some of it. Some war medals, and even an old stock certificate. That night, I put the box on the kitchen table, and we went to bed. In the morning, we were going to move the last of everything, and as we were preparing to go, I asked my roommate what she had done with the box of stuff. She said she hadn't touched it. We looked everywhere and couldn't find it. Finally, around lunch, we got hungry and decided to cook a frozen pizza. We turned on the oven and immediately began to smell something burning. When I opened the oven, there was the box. Okay, I swore my roommate did it, and she swore I did it. So we left the box on the table again and left to move some things to the new place. When we got back, the box was gone again. This time, we found it immediately in the kitchen pantry, so we kinda laughed it off and put it back on the kitchen table. About 10 minutes later, I walked into the kitchen and it was gone again. I decided the heck with it and decided to just go finish the bedroom closet I had just minutes before been working on. When I stepped up on the chair to wipe off the upper shelves, there was the box. That did it. I said out loud, "Okay, George, we promise not to take your stuff," and put the box back in the fruit cellar where we had found it. We left that day and have never been back, but I've always wondered if the next tenants ever heard from George. I've worked for a domestic violence shelter for approximately 7 years. While I personally have never seen anything, there are always odd sounds and unusual occurrences. Let me start at the beginning. The house is 2-story with an attic and a basement and over 100 years old. I really don't know much else about its history. The local domestic violence center purchased the building, which had been uninhabited for a number of years, did some renovations, and began operating an anonymous shelter for battered women and their children. Over the years, there have been numerous sightings of a young couple, A woman in a long flowing dress can be seen periodically walking up the long staircase. A man in dark, old-fashioned clothing has been seen in the living room and at the top of the stairs outside the attic door. It is usual for all who went into the attic or the basement to feel uneasy, and not alone. Recently, the sightings seem to have increased. A church group came over to the holidays to sing Christmas carols to the residents, and a young boy pointed to the ceiling and said, "Look, there's an angel." The only thing seen by the others in the room was a hazy, grayish fog that wasn't in any particular shape. A few months later, one of the employees' daughter was in the living room, alone, working on a school project, and looked up to see a gray, transparent figure looming in the doorway. She screamed, and her mother raced in to see the figure moving slowly upstairs. It was as if the ghost was checking in, and didn't mean to frighten the young girl. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of this haunting is that the couple together, fitting the same descriptions of the man and the woman seen in places of the house, have been seen in one bedroom upstairs. To my knowledge, at least 3 residents in the last year have been awakened at night to see the woman sitting on the edge of the bed, with a man standing behind her. The couple has been described as comforting and reassuring to those who have seen them in this manner. And these apparitions have seemed to know when these residents were about to face a particular trying experience. One woman was going to court the next day for an order of protection. One lady was facing a decision about the custody of her new little baby, and one woman was about to embark on the dangerous underground trying to change her identity in order to hide from the husband who tried to kill her. All 3 of these women felt as though the ghosts were trying to tell them that everything was going to be alright, and, as it turns out, the dire situations facing each of these women worked out in their favor. I personally find their presence reassuring as well. Women and children who came through the shelter are very often depressed, sometimes hopeless, scared, insecure, and anxious. I think that the fact that they are comforted by these spirits is a sign that these are good spirits who seem to approve of the work being done in their house. They've never tried to scare anyone. Sure, lights turn on and off by themselves, and the dishwasher is forever turning on by itself. Maybe they are just trying to figure out what these gadgets are. I do not know anything about the history of the house, but I assume these spirits were once residents of this house. Based on their actions, they seem to be good and well-wishing. I hope they continue to watch over the shelter and help the current residents. I just sent you info on the old Kelly house in Houston, Texas. I used to rent there with 4 other people. It's a 3-story, turn-of-the-century house built by Mr. Kelly. He owned Kelly Lumber Company and used this lumber to build the house. The rent house goes for about $2,300 to $2,000 a month as of current. It has a long history of hauntings that started right after Miss Kelly committed suicide. We found out about this info by accident, which I will describe later. I was the first to experience the haunting. I just moved in and had a friend over. The front window blinds at the entrance slammed shut and closed by themselves. It scared my friend so bad, he ran out of the house. I shared the house with 4 other adults. 2 of them, ladies, were amateur mediums. Just local psychic fairs and healing centers was their occupation. We overlooked the house together before we rented. Upstairs in the master bathroom is a set of old French windows above the sinks. It has a crank to open the windows. 2 of us tried to open it, but it was weathered and painted shut. We forced it, and it would not budge. That year, the hard freeze came early, and our first evidence to share together of the haunting became known. All 5 adults and 2 children were accounted for. Matt, one of the roommates, came down from taking a shower and asked was there any reason for us having the other bathroom windows open. Sandy and I looked at each other with raised eyebrows, with disbelief. We asked Matt again to be sure we had heard him right. We investigated. Sure enough, when we got to the top of the stairs, you could feel the cold winds blowing. As we entered the bathroom, Sandy and I stood shocked to see the French windows fully opened. We debated the issue in our heads, but there is no way Matt himself could open the French windows by himself, even if he was on steroids. I tried to reel in the windows using the crank. It was rusty and hard to close. I had to use tools to shut it. That moment on, we all knew we had a problem on our hands. A few weeks later, Sandy wanted to use the house as a gathering of friends to share vegetarian meals. Her ambition expanded to the public. For public relations, she wanted to write something about the house, but steered away from haunting stories. She struggled with different concepts, but succumbed to telling the story of a couple and their tragic love for each other. The story is about a recently engaged, mischievous young lady that plays a practical joke on her fiancé at their engagement party. From the upstairs balcony, she pours water on her boo down below. This enrages him, and he scolds her with fever. Shocked and dismayed, she bursted out into tears and ran to the other side of the house to the porch, which was located on the second floor. Heartbroken and drunken with wine, she hangs herself. It wasn't until violent weather did the secrets come out. On October 13th, 1993, a tornado paid us a visit. It was all over the nation, in CNN. It was simply unheard of. A tornado touching down near a large downtown area, especially in Houston. The tornado struck our neighbors next door in the apartment building across the street. Because of her national cover, and Sandy's interview with news reporters being broadcast over the nation, it prompted an old resident to pay us a visit. The granddaughter of Mr. and Mrs. Kelly came by to see if we were all right, and wanted to share pictures and stories about the house. We wanted to ask her questions too, without sounding nuts. We already had a couple of occurrences of the hauntings since then. We decided to manipulate her in going upstairs to the upstairs master bathroom. Then, we unfolded to her the news about the house and its little gifts. She hesitated on entering the bathroom, which raised questions in our minds. We told her about the windows, and suddenly, she started to get very nervous. She finally told us that the house was in fact haunted. It was in that very room where she found her grandmother hanging from the ceiling. One night way after the death of her grandmother, she went into that room and saw the apparition of her grandmother laying in a fetal position in the corner of the room. She could hear faint sobs in the room many times before, and in another encounter from that same room, she saw 3 ghosts hanging from the ceiling. She said they were too dark to make out, that they were just silhouettes. It was like they were hung like chandeliers and were swinging gently. The room used to be a screened-in porch overlooking her grandmother's garden. She was so overwrought with pain in her knees so much, so she couldn't garden anymore. It crippled her to the point where she was using a wheelchair and had an elevator installed. She couldn't take it anymore and took her own life. Margaret, one of the other roommates, always complained about her knees. I started to have problems myself. She told us about their dog, which is buried out back near the pool. The granddaughter heard scratching noises when she was a little girl at the back door. The dog had been dead for years. She would hear a cabinet open and shut when the scratching sound occurred. Then the sounds would stop. She says of seeing an apparition of her grandmother in the garden, and it was too much to bear, and never stepped foot in the house again till this day. I would be more than glad one day to show you the house. Many people that lived in the house had shared similar stories and are still around the neighborhood. Drop a word or two. When I was in my 20s, I'm 30 now, I used to always go camping with my older brother during the autumn months in Washington state. This story won't be very long, but it'll always be an unforgettable experience. On one of the days we were venturing out to go camping, we ended up taking the back roads on the way to the campground. The total drive was about 3 hours long, and got up early in the morning to make the drive. If you're unfamiliar with Washington state scenery, it is breathtaking. Lots of trees towering over you as you drive through, mountainous landscapes, green pastures, etc. It is, in my humble opinion, the best place to be in America. Well, anyway, we ended up staying for a couple of nights and set up a tent in the middle of these woods in the campground. It was just us and nature. I remember we sat on a log and built up a fire every night, roasted s'mores, admired the beauty of the nature here, and just took in the impressive scenery, as we usually do. One of the nights we were doing this, my brother thought he heard another person scream "help me" from afar. "Josh, you think that person is in trouble?" he remarked. I didn't hear the sound, so I dismissed it and told him how absurd it was, because I was certain we were the only ones here. "Come on, Tim, we always camp here. Nobody is here." At that point, my brother insisted that he heard a voice, pleading for help. He even said that while we were asleep in the tent one of the nights, he could see a shadow moving around just outside the tent. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it in the direction of where he saw the shadow moving, but it was gone. Another night, he could have sworn that someone was unzipping the tent while we were sleeping. He took out his flashlight and got out of the tent to investigate. He said that he saw a mist slowly disappear and dissolve into the trees. I remember the last night we were there, my brother and I had a debate on whether or not the campgrounds here used to be an Indian settlement. We later found out that the Native Americans were known to frequent these lands, and that there was a story long ago that a little boy drowned in a nearby river. He has been known to haunt the campgrounds. Anywho, as we were talking, the campfire that we just started went out the moment we mentioned anything about Native Americans. It was not windy at all, and the fire was very strong. It startled us so much that after a couple hours, we said we had enough and ended up driving home later that night. It was about 3 a.m. as we were heading back home, and we started the car up. I ended up driving us back home because my brother was too rattled from all the events. Now, this is the freakiest part. My brother told me that as we were leaving the campground, he saw an old Native American man with a beard in the rearview mirror, with a tomahawk in his hands. He was pointing towards the car, and he looked completely human. I looked into the rearview mirror myself, and saw absolutely nothing. Either my brother was playing games with me, or we just invaded the territory of natives, and they were very upset with us. Hi, my name is Diane. Growing up in Detroit, my family lived in a house that was haunted. On several occasions, my family would hear loud crashes that could only be described as boxes of dishes being smashed. Everyone in my family experienced several ghost contacts in one form or another. On 3 different occasions with 3 different family members, a man about 60 was seen wearing a plaid flannel shirt. This man merely stood there, looking at the person, never attempting communication or harm. I was about 8 when he appeared, and I was the first one to see him. Although my sister, who was 7 years older than me, was not present. I'm telling you this right now so later you will understand. My relatives from out of town were visiting, and the adults were sitting in the living room after dinner. I was extremely quiet, in the hopes that only a child can have, that they would forget that I was there. I was sitting on the couch, and the front door was open, with the screen door closed. I saw the man wearing a red plaid shirt, standing at the front door and looking in. I told my family about this, and they thought I was overtired, so they put me to bed. Later that same week, my older sister was getting into the shower when she saw a man in a red plaid shirt standing in the bathroom with her. She freaked out and told my mother, who this time listened more closely. She then revealed that she too had seen the man in the red shirt standing in the kitchen by the sink, looking like he was getting a glass of water. All family members routinely heard footsteps throughout the house, especially going upstairs into an attic bedroom. The steps would continue across the floor. All family members experienced this together and separate on several different occasions. My sister, whose bedroom it was for a while, admitted she was scared to sleep in that room and was frightened, very often thinking that someone was coming into her room. I later had that same bedroom and became so afraid of it that I began sleeping on the living room sofa. On several occasions, dishes in the house would break when put in a certain china cabinet. On 2 separate occasions, a silver meat platter in the china cabinet, whose doors were kept closed, flew across the room at my mother. Lights turned off in the basement would be on when we woke up every single morning. The dryer would routinely come on by itself, and even after the electric was checked, this still continued. The basement had an old coal room that had been converted into a storage room with paint cans and stuff. This room had a negative feeling, and no one in the family liked to even go in there. Likewise, no one in the family wanted to go under the stairs, although no one ever had a mysterious occurrence in those places. Every family member in that house had their name called on different occasions, many times when they were home alone. One occasion comes to mind. My father, who was home alone, was working in the basement. My mother, sister, and I were out shopping at the mall. He distinctly heard the front door open, even though it was locked, and someone walked across the living room and kitchen. He went upstairs and found the front door locked, as he knew he would. It was then that someone called his name. He answered, and no one said anything after that. Another all-family experience came when we all went to visit my grandmother, who lived across town. We even brought the family dog. We were returning home, and as we pulled in the driveway, I saw the drapes move back, like someone was watching us return. I remember distinctly asking if anybody had seen that. My father countered, "What did you see?" I told him, and he and my mother and sister agreed that that is what they saw too. My dad went into the house first while we waited in the car. Everything was just as we left it, with the doors locked. On one occasion I awoke to having a woman standing at the foot of my bed. She disappeared as soon as I got a good look at her. She said her name was Anne and she had lived in that house. No one in that house ever saw Anne again. This house had an addition that was a formal dining room off the back. It had built-in china cabinets that would fly open on no occasion, even after my mother put hooks on them, thinking the wood was swelling. Music was often playing softly. All in all, it was a weird place to live, and we are all very glad to move, but we did live there for over 20 years. My parents moved into an apartment, as I did in a different location, while staying with them because I had become extremely ill. I had a unique experience of a ghost nurse who took care of me. My parents were asleep, and I was lying on the sofa, so hot, but lucid. I could hear them snoring from the bedroom. I heard soft slippers shuffle across the floor and felt a cold hand lovingly touch my forehead, checking my fever, a comfort. I was not afraid, and somehow thought Grandma was here, but I had no evidence of this. I remember keeping my eyes closed, just knowing my nurse did not want me to see her. I was very conscious of my parents snoring and knew it was not them. When the feet shuffled off, I opened my eyes and got up and looked at my parents. They were sound asleep. The whole situation lasted maybe 2 minutes, yet I started to improve that night. I now live in Indiana, and a few years ago, my husband and I rented a little farmhouse. Our landlord lived right behind us, and the farmhouse used to belong to his grandparents, now both deceased. Not long after we moved in, we began to hear things, and my 2-year-old daughter would wake up in fear, crying about a man in her room. I would say, "Where?" and she would point to a corner of the room, but I would see nothing. We would often hear footsteps coming up the basement stairs with no one there. This is happening in front of other witnesses also. We would sometimes hear a man in the basement talking, but couldn't make out what he was saying. Now, the basement was a creepy place where I always sensed being watched and followed. There was a little room that used to hold well water with a heavy door that had the window painted white. I felt this room was evil, and I hated it. Unfortunately, my washer and dryer were down in the basement, so I had to go there often. For a long time, the ghost just made noises, not meant to scare, just moving about the house. Later, he would come into our bedroom at night. I never realized it until I saw your site and David and Sherry's site, but he came in the room a lot more than the 2 times I saw him in human form. I would either be asleep or almost asleep, and I would see a ball of light drift slowly into the room. It would sometimes move to the side in front of my closet, or to my horror, it would come right at me and hover right above me. I didn't realize then that the orb was the ghost. I thought I was dreaming a weird dream that seemed like I was awake, because I saw the room exactly like I was awake, apparently because I was awake. I would be half asleep and angry at myself for having such terrifying visions, so I would angrily think in my mind, "Get out of here, stop," and it would disappear. Twice after that, I woke up to see a 30 to 40-year-old man with dark hair and a red and black lumberjack shirt. I would catch him staring at me beside my bed. Oddly, I was so tired that I just rolled over and went back to sleep. I found out later from my friend who used to live next door to the house that my landlord's grandfather had died in the house. His name was Pete. Also, he had been a grumpy old man. Funny thing was that both times I saw him, he was a younger man. Anyways, he never really bothered us, so we had no problem. We only moved out because we bought a new house this past year. To this day, I still can't believe I calmly co-abided with a ghost. I've been reading stories on this page for over a year now. Why? I don't know. I'll always find myself scared at night. But I, look forward to the new entries every month. I thought it might be time to submit my scariest. I'm very sensitive to the spiritual world, so I have many. Okay, a few years ago, I met my current husband, Joe, during the beginning stages of his nasty divorce to his wife, Jennifer. Jennifer was raised in a Jewish family that had a lot of problems. Before they married, they lived in the downstairs apartment of Joe's father's house. His sister and her family lived upstairs. They had experienced some ghostly activity when they were children there, but it was all positive, like smelling roses throughout the house. Jennifer's brother, Andrew, had joined a devil-worshipping cult and moved to California. Eventually, he realized it was crazy and sick, so he hopped on a bus and journeyed home to Massachusetts. At every stop, one of the members was standing outside the bus, just staring at him. He made it home, but did not escape. They came to him at night, played head games, and did not allow him to let go of the devil. He was also very heavy into drugs. Joe was, and still is, a member of AA, so he invited Andrew to live with them while he tried to recover and get off the drugs. Unfortunately, Andrew couldn't, and one day he said to us, "I just want to live to see you two get married." A few weeks after their wedding, Andrew was found hanging from a tree in a nearby park. After the funeral, Joe was consoling Jennifer when he heard 3 knocks on the door. He went to answer it, but no one was there. All of a sudden, a rush of energy entered his body, and then everything went black. Joe awoke to his brother-in-law, holding him down and trying to stop him from convulsing. He had come downstairs to find out what the knocks were from. Joe and Jennifer got Andrew's wonderful leather living room set. They moved to Connecticut and split up shortly thereafter. I came along pretty quickly and also got pregnant pretty quickly as well, so we were not allowed to see the family, for they were ashamed of Joe's actions. One night, I had a nightmare of being chased by an evil and angry spirit through a house I had never seen before. I was flying from room to room, up many stairs. Finally, I went into a room where there was a child spirit on a bed, and very scared. I remember holding it while watching the spirit fly up the stairs at us. Then, I awoke. I told Joe about this because it was so vivid. He just about died. I described every room down to the wallpaper of his father's house that his sister still lives in. We were invited over shortly after. His family began to forgive him and understood his reasoning, not to mention they had a beautiful niece, granddaughter, that they did not know. When I walked in, I knew I had been there before. Amy, Joe's 7-year-old niece, said, "I knew you had blonde hair. I had a dream about you last week." Strange. A year later, I went to a psychic who I had never met before. She told me a lot of stuff about my guides and messages from them. Well, one was this. That spirit that was chasing you, it is the sibling of your boyfriend's ex-lover. And that was it. We just finally sold that dang leather furniture. I hope Andrew leaves me alone now. This is a true story that happened to me. It is one of many, and I mean many stories, that happened to me that involve spirits. It started one night. I was spending the night at my grandma's house in the spare bedroom. She has 2 spare bedrooms. One is mine, and one is my older sister Tammy's. I used to sleep in my room, but after that incident happened about a year ago, and no one died or anything. The room just went wacko from the presence of a spirit when me and my friend Damien were in it. I haven't gone in there since. So now I stay in my sister's room, since she doesn't visit as much as I do. I was laying down, looking at the white ceiling, like I always do when I can't sleep. All of a sudden, I saw a black shadow coming from the bottom of my eyes. It slowly covered my whole vision, and it turned black. It was holding my head down, so I couldn't even move. I got so scared that I swung my hand at it, and it was just like swinging at smoke. It just separated and then moved back together. The most terrifying and weirdest part of this all is that it really seemed like there were eyes, glowing red eyes, that were coming from this black shadow. The next time I met the black figure was when I was at home. I was having a sleepover with my friend Sarah in the basement. We were both on the pull-out couch across the room from the bar. She turned and looked over and then saw the black figure just staring at her with glowing red eyes and leaning up against the bar right in front of her back. She slept facing the other way for the rest of the night. Again, I had a sleepover with Sarah in the basement. This time, I saw it. It came through the roof right above me with its arms and legs straight out to its side, as if it was in the shape of a star. When it popped through the roof, I could see smoke come from around its body. What is this thing? Why is it following me? What does it want? Will it hurt me? And then slowly, it lowered itself towards me. I was so frightened. I didn't want to tell Sarah because she might get scared, so I pressed my head into the bed, trying to stay away. I was right in my sleeping bag, so I couldn't swat at it again. And then Sarah leaned over and asked, "What are you doing?" Then I told her, "That thing is right above me." She looked around me and saw nothing. "There's nothing there, Trisha." And I thought, how could she not see this? It's right there. How could she not see this? And then I said, "Hey, it's right there. It's right above me." She then tried to prove that there was nothing there and waved her hand over the top of me. Just as she did that, the figure jumped up and spread its arms and legs again and just popped through the roof. That was the last time that I saw that figure. I have many other stories. Most of them I'm going to submit to this page. If you have any questions, or if you want to talk to me about spirits, ghosts, or angels, email me. Odd things have always happened to my family. As a child, I was raised by my grandparents on the hoops of a reservation. There was no question to there being spirits on a reservation. My grandfather came from a long line of medicine men. Although he doesn't practice medicine, he says he remembers everything he witnessed while he was learning to practice. Something scared him to death, and some things he says are very comforting. He says it was a practice of good versus evil. Some ceremonies were so intense that they were physically attacked by apparitions. Large, small, white, sometimes gray or black images. He says the spirits are present all the time, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. He always said if I was harmed in any way, I shouldn't point blame to anyone or anything. He said to express in words, "You aren't getting the best of me, just loud enough for me to hear it." Even when whispered, it was a means of protection. He said sometimes late at night, family members that have passed away would come knocking at his window, mostly his brother. He said he knew when it was his brother and when it wasn't. His brother gave him a sense of happiness or protection, but the others came with evil intentions. He said that all encounters are warnings and signs of bad things that are about to happen, or when sickness was about to fall on the family members. He said he knew when evil ones were around. When they came to his window, he would feel a cold breeze, then a strong sense of fright. Chills would overwhelm his body, and then a split second before he saw or heard anything, he would be paralyzed, completely taken over. The chills got worse, and when he would try to yell, nothing would come out. Sometimes he said he felt like he was dying and feeling every bit of it. Of course, This only time this happened was when it was pitch black in his room. Sometimes they reached in for him, from outside his window or from right underneath his bed. He said it wasn't the same feel as someone grabbing you physically. Their grasp pierced right through to the bone, much like a snake wrapping tightly around you. Only every bit of the inside would also feel constricted, right down to the bone. We always had traditional singing gourds hung up around the house. These were used for funeral wakes. Almost every time a force was present, it was through a dead family member, even if it was just a dark shadow. The dead were used as portals to reach the livelihood of our people. He said the gourd served as a warning system. If a force entered our house, the gourds would rattle like crazy, much like an alarm system, protecting the house from theft. He said this would cause the dead to return to their resting place. It was a reminder that the person was dead, and that he was only causing distress. The evil using it had no way of evading or entering our house. If the force was strong enough, the gourds would not work. He said if that happened, we would all experience cold chills and a sense of fright. He said you'd have to feel so scared you wouldn't want to move, and that if you didn't convince yourself to move, it would only get worse, and that one person would be taken as an outlet for the family. Sickness or death would fall that person. To this day, I've never seen or experienced anything of that nature, but deep down inside, I know it's all true. I've heard the gourds go off, but never felt anything. My grandfather says they still visit him. I love my grandfather for everything he has shared with me. He says that all of this is only fair warning, and that this happens to everyone. Some just don't notice. The next time you fall or get in a fight, just think, who is really behind it all? I could go on, but I think it's best to stop here. Okay, here's a story I heard from my dad. My dad used to work at a warehouse at the Goodyear facilities in Akron, Ohio. There were stories floating around about various ghosts and whatnot associated with the various buildings in the planned campus, which, if you ever visited Akron, you know, sprawls over a vast area. Anyway, one of these stories involved a ghost that followed you through various warehouses as you walked and was never seen, only heard. My dad was always working swing shifts at this plant, very little seniority, and so he was there at all kinds of wacky hours. One night in the winter, he was working the midnight shift in one of the supposedly haunted buildings. There was only 4 guys in this particular building, and my dad, being the rookie in the place, was given all the crappy jobs. At about 3 in the morning, my dad's supervisor instructed him to go to the 3rd floor of the building, back in the oldest part of it, to pick up some fluorescent lights, because the small storage area in the machine room was out of them, and they needed to replace a few. So, being as superstitious as you can be, my dad was sure he was gonna see a ghost in that very dark, very scary old building. Up the dark stairs my dad went, one by one, sweat pouring off his face. Even though this part of the building was barely heated, when he finally reached the 3rd floor, he felt a little stronger, probably adrenaline. So he bravely pushed open the door to the adjoining room, between the stairwell and the storage room. This room used to be a rubber cutting room. It wasn't used for anything anymore, since manual rubber cutting was no longer done. There were a few large containers sitting around, but for the most part, the room was empty. There was a thick layer of dust covering most of the room, except for a small path where people walked to get various items from the storage room. Spiderwebs everywhere, and the occasional squeak from a disgruntled rat were just enough to give my dad the total spine chills. But he pushed on, being a man and not supposed to be afraid of anything. He started walking across the abandoned rubber cutting room towards the storage area when very faintly he heard footsteps behind him. Whirling around ready to fight, he peered into the dimness. Nothing was there. He assumed it was his nerves, which he had worked into a frenzy by this point, and he turned quickly, embarrassed, and continued towards the storage area when, sure enough, more footsteps. He slowed. They slowed. He sped up. They sped up. With his heart racing, he slowly turned around. Still, nothing was there. Drenched with sweat and scared nearly to tears, he bolted towards the storage room, his feet pounding heavily on the thin metal floor. The footsteps were even louder now. Every step he took, another step followed, not an echo, but right behind him. He made it to the storage room, fumbled with the lock, ran inside, and slammed the door behind him. The room was very small. All he could hear was the pounding of his heart, threatening to blow right through his chest. The only way out was the way he came. After calming down a bit and smoking about 5 cigarettes, he was feeling brave again. He grabbed a large box of lights, decided to fling open the door, and run like hell as fast as he could cover the 50 to 75 feet to the stairwell. Getting up his nerve, he grabbed the door handle. He slowly turned it. As soon as he heard the click of the latch opening, he flung open the door and sprinted towards the light in the stairwell. There were the footsteps again, closer than ever, right behind him. That's when it happened, tripping over something. He sprawled headfirst into the darkness. Total quiet met him. Darkness and quiet. He slowly rose to his feet, putting one hand behind him to help him get to his feet. Once again, the footsteps crept up behind him. That's when he finally got the guts to look in the direction where the footsteps were coming from, and what he saw astonished him. He saw an old man wearing an eye patch and had a cane in his hand. He had suspenders and overalls on, and a blue hat on that resembled Mario from Super Mario Bros. The guy only appeared for about 30 seconds, but it was long enough to notice the presence. The figure disappears. He rose to his feet and walked back to his coworkers, never telling any of them of what he found. Years later, he still tells stories about sending the new rookies up there in the middle of a dark night when all is quiet to walk across the metal floored room to get light bulbs that aren't really needed. It all started when I was about 10 or 11. This story is very true, by the way. We had moved into a new house in northeastern Wisconsin. Let me explain where my room was. There was a porch, and then the door into our house. To the left was the kitchen, to the right was the laundry room. And if you were to go straight when you entered the door, there was a staircase. It led to the attic, where my room was. The staircase was not very long at all, 12 steps to be exact. When you went into the attic, there was a bathroom if you went straight. My room if you turned left, and to the right was a living room with a TV. One night, while I was laying in bed trying to sleep, I heard creaking up the steps. I thought it was my cat or one of the dogs, so I wasn't scared. I counted the number of steps I heard. There was 12. I noticed it sounded like a person coming up. I remembered every creak the steps made. I looked at the staircase, which I could see from where my bed was. I noticed some sort of dim light from the top step. The lights in the kitchen were off,
and so was the upstairs light. I hid under the blankets, hoping for it to go away. I listened closely and heard 12 steps going down the stairs. Every night from then on, I heard the steps. One night, after I heard the steps going down the stairs, I got out of bed and looked at the bottom of the staircase. It was very dark, but I thought I could see a crumpled figure. Then a few days later, I saw a figure in white glide up the same staircase. It actually looked like a floating sheet and sort of resembled the Grim Reaper. I would start to see a lot of different types of spirits moving along the staircase. The last one I remember was a floating head that darted down the stairs. 3 years later, we moved into a new house in Indiana. One night, my mother told me that a little boy had died in the house in Wisconsin because he fell down the stairs. She didn't want to tell me when we lived there because it might frighten me. To this day, I'm still very haunted by that. Back in September of 1982, my boyfriend of 4 years named Keith and I were visiting his sister Julie, her husband, and family in Orneco, Minnesota. He was 17 and I was 21, an odd age range, but he looked every bit my age and was mature as well. Sitting up late, we were talking, and for some reason, we got on the subject of death. I asked him if he believed in the afterlife, and he said that he did not. He believed that when it was over, but he knew I believed, and I asked that in case there was an afterlife of any sort, and that if we were able, that if one of us should die before the other, that the one who died would come back and watch over the one left behind. He agreed. As time passed, Keith needed his space, and I gave it to him, reluctantly at times, to the point where we would get into heated arguments, and I would move out of his house, where we lived together with his father. In June 1983, on a windy, extremely hot Wednesday night, Keith died in a fire that consumed their trailer house. I hadn't been with Keith for about 3 months, as our breakups and makeups were getting more sporadic. I recall trying to hitchhike to his place that night, 12 miles away, but as I stood on the highway for what seemed like 45 minutes, I just wasn't getting a ride. It was strange, because I hitchhiked the highway regularly and never had a problem getting a ride within 5 or 10 minutes. But that night, it was mostly humid and so hot that within minutes of leaving my apartment to go to the highway, I was soaked with sweat, like I had just taken a shower and didn't dry off. So, I went back home. The next day, my sister contacted me, saying that Keith had died the night before. I was devastated. My whole world fell to pieces. I spent the next few days with Keith's dad at Julie's house, preparing and attending the wake. At the wake, I was alone in the viewing room with Julie, and everyone else was downstairs visiting. It was a closed coffin service, but I had written a letter to Keith and wanted to place it in the coffin. But due to the extensive damage to Keith's body in the fire, the funeral home director would not let me see him. So I decided to put the letter in the small groove between the top and bottom halves of the coffin. As I was putting it there, a gust of wind came out of nowhere. It seemed to come right from the groove where I was about to place the letter. It was so strong and sudden that I screamed. People came from downstairs to see what the matter was, and I told them I had seen a mouse. No one in their right mind would believe me, and besides, maybe it could be explained some way I could not figure out. The night before the funeral, I was having a tough time trying to sleep due to the emotional turmoil I had faced from hearing the tragic news. I couldn't stop crying, and I was absolutely devastated. Just then, I felt a cold breeze brush past my face while I was still laying down in bed and hysterically crying. I then felt the weight of the bed getting heavier, like someone else was sitting on the bed. I screamed Keith instinctively and laid up in bed. The bed instantly felt lighter, and I could have sworn I saw a small ball of light move around the room before disappearing. During the wake, I had a 110 camera and took several pictures of the coffin. These pictures I will have to retrieve from Julie, as I've gotten married 6 years ago and gave my photo album a key to her as a means of trying to let go of the past and move forward into my new life with my husband and daughter. But when I do, if I can't figure out how to scan them and get them on here, I will send them in. I believe I have something here. Also, in closing, I realized the depth of the promise we made to each other that night, just months before Keith died, and have spoken aloud, hoping I will release him if we're bound in any way, that I release him of his promise and set him free several times in the past few years. Thank you for reading. In this story, my wife and I had moved, and we rented a 60-year-old plus house because the landlord allowed pets. My wife had misgivings about the house from the first day we viewed it, but she agreed to move in. We lived there for 6 months, August 1997 through January 1998. She had a strange feeling about the staircase, as if something bad had happened or would happen to one of us. I couldn't blame her, for the staircase was dark with no railing and carpeted so that it could be easy for someone to fall down the stairs. She also swears she heard old-time music playing in her bedroom late at night. I never heard it, and I don't believe it was our neighbors. She also said she would see people out of the corners of her eyes when she was alone. This hadn't happened to her before, and hasn't since in our new house, which we have lived in for 9 months. The strange coincidence is this. One afternoon, I was in the bathroom taking a shower when I saw movement about the size of a human move across the floor in front of the sink towards the door. I thought it was my wife, so I opened the door, but she wasn't around. About a week later, we were talking about how cold and where the house was. My wife told me, in addition to the music and odd feelings, that when she was taking a shower, she had seen movement in the front of the sink going towards the door. I told her that the same thing had happened to me. I thought that perhaps reflections off moving cars in the street in front of the house could explain the movement, but it wasn't sunny when I showered. At this point, I was freaked out, so in addition to poor insulation, bats in the attic and mice in the walls, we had ghosts. We moved out within a few months. It started when I was just a little girl. I would see things in my room at night, movement, shadows, in dark forms. I was told that it was a dream and I should not watch scary things on TV. Now that I am 29 years old and I'm not dreaming, I know this for a fact. The ghosts started to intensify when I was pregnant with my first child. I was 21 and still at home. I would wake up in the night with a feeling of being watched. Afraid to open my eyes, I would anyway, and the same man would be there looking over me without an expression and cold eyes. I tried sleeping with the light on, but this did not stop it. I knew it could not be a dream because it was the same image every night. My son was born and we moved into our own place, about 8 blocks away from my home. The man did not appear for a few months, but he did eventually show himself. Frightened every night as to what I would wake up and see, My husband worked out of town during the week, so I had my best friend come stay with me. I warned her that in the night, I sometimes scream because of what I see. Hesitant at first to believe me. Then, the screams came, and she too was a believer. My friend eventually moved into her own place. What happened next, I can't explain. My friend has never experienced any ghosts or such, but one morning, while lying in her bed, she felt something jump up on it, like a cat would. The only thing is, she didn't have a cat. Before she knew it, she was frozen, as if someone was lying atop her and restricting her movement. The incident left as soon as it came, but she was well aware that this was an event that she could not get over. She moved shortly after. The stranger thing was that the man I'd seen for 4 years was gone. Had he been the one at her house? Did he move on with her? I will never know. I've never seen him since. My husband and I eventually bought our own home and began to move. The last night in our apartment, I awoke to at least 6 to 8 apparitions above my bed. The spooky thing was that I was pregnant with our second child. It was as if they came to say goodbye. We got settled into our new home. Incidentally, it's 3 blocks from our apartment. It was about a year before the first incident. We knew when we moved in that the lady of the house had died here. That is who I expected to see, but quite the contrary. It was a man in police dress, like you would see at a funeral or graduation. His image appeared in the mirror next to my bed. He's the only one of the many ones that I've seen here. Now I only see an image once, and never again do they appear. Some months, it is every night. In some months, none at all. Just when I think they are gone, I wake up and scream. They never touch me or try to talk to me. They just stand there and stare at me. The lights can be on or off. It does not matter. I think that my younger son is experiencing the same thing, but I do not know how to ask him without scarring him. Some nights, he sits straight up in bed and cries and points with terror on his face. I look, but there is nothing there. All I want to know is if I'll ever be able to go to sleep and be confident that I won't wake up screaming. Thank you for your time, and hopefully someone out there can relate to me. I've had numerous experiences with supernatural entities, but one that sticks out in my mind happened to my brother and I about 2 years ago. I have a cleaning service and clean many buildings at night, but the case in point occurred at a clinic in an older district of South Fort Worth. One night, my brother and I were finishing up at this clinic. I have a habit of walking through a building before we lock up to be sure everything is secure and the lights are off. My brother was in the lobby area of the clinic, preparing to leave, when I informed him I was going to check the building. There are 4 hallways in this clinic, with many examining rooms, so I proceeded to walk the building. About halfway through my walk, I heard another pair of steps, about 10 foot or so behind me. I assumed it was my brother coming to help me, so I started talking to him. At the last stop of my walkthrough, there was a break room. I reached in to turn off the light of the break room and turned around, facing back towards the direction from which I had come, expecting my brother. What I turned to was not my brother, but the upper torso of a male figure, somewhat see-through and misty white. I blurted out a few choice words, and the figure was gone. After this experience, my brother as well heard many strange things as well as the figure of a female. I was talking to one of the doctors one day in the receptionist area when I noticed a picture on the wall Instantly, I recognized one of the people in the picture with the figure I'd seen. A cold chill came over my body at this point. I pointed out the picture to the doctor and asked who this person was. The doctor stated that he was the doctor who founded the clinic in 1929 and had died in 1985. I thought to myself, I knew doctors worked a lot of overtime, but this was going to an extreme. In the mid-1980s, my wife and I bought a home in Hanover Park, Illinois. It was a neglected house, which had a hard time selling and was being rented. The owners lived in a different state, and the tenants let the place go pretty bad. We saw a lot of possibilities, and the price was right. So we moved in, and things were, to put it bluntly, bad. The place was filthy. There were spiders everywhere. The gas wasn't on in late October, and it was raining continually. So I'm sitting in the living room area questioning my sanity when I see this blob of haze, a little larger than a basketball, round in shape, start moving across the living room about 7 feet away and just sort of floats into the dining room and out the patio door. It just went through the door and out of the house. I'm like, am I seeing things now? Or was that an apparition? It was weird because I wasn't scared. It was more like, wow, what the heck was that? We finally got the place in shape, and it turned out to be a nice home. We had our first child just before moving in, and it was nice to have a place of our own. I never mentioned the apparition to my wife, lest she think I was really losing it. A few months later in the spring, other things started happening. My son, who was now a full year, would wake up in the night, laughing deliriously. My wife thought it was hilarious. I never mentioned what I'd seen to her. She couldn't figure out what was so funny. I remained tight-lipped. This happened on a regular basis for about a month. Then one day, she calls me at work in a panic, saying that Chris, our son, got out of his crib and was sitting on the floor playing with his toys. Fine, except Chris couldn't walk just yet and definitely lacked climbing skills. So how did he get out? If he tumbled out, he would have most likely have been hurt or screaming at the very least. To this day, we don't know how, and he has no recollection of the event. Other events included the TV turning on at night, a strange happening of voices in the night, strong flowery odors, a feeling my wife once described as having passed through by something, and the car shutting down in front of the house once we moved out. We sort of visited, and when we passed the front of the house, the car just shut down. It restarted with no problem, and had no problems before, or any time soon thereafter. Weird. I was dating a guy when I was 14, about 5 years ago. His house had been built over an old well. The story goes that in the early 1900s, 2 children were playing near this well, and the little girl fell in, and her brother tried to help, but fell in too. Their parents didn't know they were missing for a while, but by the time they got there, it was too late. Well, they moved, and another house was built over it. My boyfriend's closet was built over this well. One night, it was raining really hard, and he was playing his guitar. A bolt of lightning struck right outside his window and lit up the whole room. About 10 seconds after that happened, we heard children laughing. I looked in the corner of his room and saw 2 children standing there, staring at us. I just sat there and stared back. They stood there for about 30 seconds and then vanished. After that, you would find things misplaced and then find them later. He came home on several occasions to find his room messed up. He would pick it up, leave, come back, and it would be messed up again. We broke up soon after that, and I've never heard about the children again.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the new compilation. Hope you don't mind. I'm going to be adding this compilation. Love you guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Please remember to comment, like, and subscribe at the end of this video.